This House believes that climate change is a problem of wealthy nations. As you know, the Calcutta Debating Circle aims to propagate and popularize the art of debating, and the whole idea of this debate, therefore, is for you to see some of the finest talents in debating from this city and from abroad. I will say nothing about the motion quite now, except to tell you that, of course, you know that the debate consists of three components: ethos, logos, and pathos. As Aristotle said, ethos means that you have to be very dominant. You have to be somebody who's speaking with such conviction everybody knows you're the world authority on climate change. You have to speak with logos, which means that you must have adequate logic in your argument. And finally, there must be an element of pathos, the emotion that cheers up the response in the hearts of the audience and make them desirous of raising their right hand at the appropriate moment when we come to the voting. Just in case you wonder, this is the three categories on which the judges are also going to judge you on content, delivery, and your ability to handle refutations. The Calcutta Debating Society, of course, always maintains a stance of neutrality, an example of which you saw when we were introducing our first judge. We always seek not to upset any group of people, or we upset both groups of people equally. That's called balanced act. So when they introduced Mr. Utpal Chatterjee, I noticed the introducer saying he is the legend of Bengal, which would certainly have upset one individual in our state. And then, fortunately, he said he is also the best Indian citizen, which would also upset an individual in the country. And since these two individuals are on two opposite sides, we play the correct game of neutrality at the Calcutta Debating Circle. No mention of who these individuals could possibly be. On that note, may I invite Shinjini Palit of Presidency College to be the first speaker in favor of the motion.
The motion of today is that climate change is a problem of the wealthy nations. And as the first speaker of the House, I feel it is imperative for me to first characterize as to what we call a problem, or what we characterize a problem as on our side of the House today. It is a well-established fact that climate change, or as I should be saying now, climate emergency, is not just an inconvenience that is a myth. It is a fact, and it is a fact that has been plaguing the entire world alike. On our side of the House, when we say problem, we allude to the fact that it is a moral burden, an imperative moral burden, exclusively on the sides of the wealthy nations first. And throughout the course of my speech, I will establish to you why. To begin with, who started this problem in the first place, right? Wasn't it the wealthy nations who had started aggressively industrializing with no concern for the environment, which is the reason why we are all in this mess in the first place? Back when the Industrial Revolution started in England and the waters of Manchester were polluted and millions of workers died of multiple reasons, health hazards which were a result of the rapid industrialization, nobody batted an eye as to what effect it was having on the environment. The wealthy nations continue now, even now as I stand here and talk in 2020, continue to be the largest part of the problem. The United States of America and China together account for over 41.8% of the entire world's CO2 per capita emissions, right? So the wealthy nations are the people that put us in this problem in the first place, which is why it is an imperative moral burden on their side to take the first initiative to address this problem, which brings me to my second point, right? How do they solve this problem? Why am I giving this burden of solving or addressing climate change exclusively to the wealthy nations? It's because they are the nations that have the means to solve this problem. They are the wealthy nations that have capitalized off of the nations they have colonized before, the developing, the not so wealthy nations nations now, and as a result of which now have access to this massive resource and economic capital, right? Which gives them access to some of the best brains in the world. They have some of the best scientific laboratories in the world that can come up with multiple solutions to at least lessen or decelerate the climate change that we are going through. And in saying that, not only can they come up with means to solve the problem, but they also possess the means to implement those solutions, right? These wealthy nations, ladies and gentlemen, are wealthy nations not just because they have economic capital. These nations contribute largely and control global capital flow. MNCs, listen to them. Multinational corporations are based out of them. If a United States today decides that it's going to take measures against companies that violate, sustainable environmental standards, it can afford to do so. But a remote village in Bangladesh can't just tell a factory of Levi's to retract and, because they are polluting its waters, because it's got people to feed, right? The not so wealthy nations have pressing issues. They have hunger, they have poverty, and it is not simply possible for them to perceive something as global, as big as climate change with an empty stomach. So the kind of power that these wealthy nations command over global capital, over the political scenario, gives them even more onus of taking responsibility of this climate change that is plaguing all nations alike, right? And we can clearly see that these superpowers are not owning up right now. We saw how Trump's government just walked out of the Paris Accord. We are seeing how he's rolling back multiple, environmental policies that were rolled out during Obama's times, how he's allowing for coal companies to pollute the waters even more. And I ask, why are they doing this, right? Why do we think that these countries who have the ability to be able to control or decelerate this climate change are not doing it, right? It is, of course, to maintain their hegemonic standards in the society. We see from data that between 1961 to 2012, 18 countries which had their carbon emission under 10 tons have had their GDP, their median GDP decrease by 27%, whereas the 19 countries which had their CO2 emissions above 300 tons have had a 13% increase in their GDP median, right? There is a reason why more articles are being written about how much oil we'll find under Alaska than how much, at what rate Alaska is melting. Hence, I have shown you throughout my speech how first the wealthy nations are the creators of this problem and thus have the primary moral burden. Second, how they continue to be the biggest contributors of this problem. Third, how they have the means to solve and implement these solutions. And thus, it is important for us to recognize and place this burden on these wealthy nations and call them out on their irresponsibility and ask them, how dare they? Thank you.
Okay, time for interjection. You can put your hand up, and then would I ask the speaker from Jadavpur University first?
Thank you. Shinjini, in your speech you mentioned that the wealthy nations, or the so-called wealthy nations, are the only ones who can go ahead and solve this problem. So is it fair to eliminate other nations with greater collective populations that have greater stakeholders in climate change, to absolutely throw them out of the equation or out of the discourse completely?
Thank you for your question, Abhiraj. So throughout my speech, I mentioned why these countries in the first place should be addressing these problems, right? And I completely recognize and concede to the point that we have bigger stakeholders here, which is why even we see that third world countries, even like India, are trying to switch to renewable resources, right? Say a developing country pollutes or has a carbon emission of only 3%, but these countries combined have a carbon emission of 40%. So if I can stop the person who's throwing 40 plastic bags into the sea, and then focus on the single entities that are throwing one plastic bag in the sea, I think the multiplier effect will be a lot faster and we'll be able to address our problems better. Also, the very important fact being that when climate change comes to a point where we'll have to pay to use clean water, clean air and things like that, these wealthy nations will still be able to afford those solutions, right? And hence they in the first place should be able to come up with this. Because when the AQI in Delhi hit 140, clean air bars were opened in South Delhi, not in Lajpat Nagar. Thank you.
Does smoke stay confined to the borders that are delineated between different countries, or does smoke travel across borders?
Smoke definitely travels across borders, but it's very important to understand where it's emanating from. Thank you.
Thank you, Shinjini. And I think Shinjini has established what we are going to have the proposition talk to us about today, which is that the wealthy nations are the creators, contributors, characters, and criminals of climate change in the world. You know, while I was hearing her speech, though, I was wondering, who are the wealthy nations? Are the wealthy nations those that control the largest MNCs, dictate the world's largest currencies, ensure they have the world's largest nuclear arsenal, or can decide which part of the world they will invade when and how? Or are the wealthy nations the nations that have a lot more oxygen, fresh water, cleaner air to live on? After all, you can't eat gold. You can't even breathe charcoal. I'm sure taking up cudgels against the motion on that note will be Andrew Tang from Cambridge University, who's going to be the first speaker opposing the motion.
Today, we are facing one of the biggest crises of all time. People are dying in bushfires in Australia. People are being drowned in floods across low-lying nations. And people are choking in smog in China. It is not enough for rich countries and wealthy nations only to participate in the fight against climate change. We cannot be playing a blame game. 3 points in this speech today. Firstly, how climate change is a collective action problem and why this necessitates all nations to react. Secondly, how under their side of the house, polluting industries get moved to developing poorer nations, but the total amount of emissions stays the same. And thirdly, why developing and poorer countries have a lot to contribute in the fight against climate change. But quickly, a bit of clarification on the motion. By wealthy nations, we mean nations with a high GDP per capita. Those are nations like the United States, the United Kingdom, countries in Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand. These are the countries that have often polluted disproportionately in the past. They've benefited from that pollution, and that pollution has been responsible for their economic growth. And these are also the very nations that now have the most resources to tackle climate change. Now moving on to my first substantive, which is climate change as a collective action problem and how that necessitates all nations to act. So the nature of reducing emissions is such that if I reduce emissions, it is costly, right? Often, as a country, I would have to adopt more efficient technology. There is a cost to that. And the cost that I incur through reducing my emissions is less than the benefit to my country. This is similar to what Ashan pointed out, that smoke travels across borders, right? Often the cost of me reducing emissions is less than the benefit I receive, but the cost is less than the total benefit to the rest of the world, right? For this very reason, every country is actually incentivized to pollute as much as possible because the benefits of polluting exceeds the cost. Because of this, in practice, a country is unlikely to agree to decrease their emissions if other countries do not agree to do the same, because that would give them an economic advantage over other nations. For example, if the US, as a wealthy nation, is told to reduce their emissions, they're probably unwilling to do so because it will give China a direct economic advantage. And therefore, even if we take side proposition at the best case scenario, and even if we agree with their principle that wealthy nations have an increased moral burden, in practice, wealthy countries will not agree to do this, and therefore it will not tackle climate change effectively. Now moving on to my second substantive, which is how polluting industries merely just get moved to poorer developing countries. So currently in the world, manufacturing industries base themselves in countries where the costs of production are the cheapest, right? That's why you see most of your clothes being made in countries like Bangladesh or China, where the costs of production are lower than, let's say, the United States or the United Kingdom. So that means if rich countries are forced to reduce their emissions, this will necessarily increase their cost of production because now they have to adopt more efficient technology, right? And that means manufacturing industries, often in these wealthier countries, is no longer profitable. So what happens then is that these polluting industries merely just get moved from wealthier nations to poorer nations. It means that the total amount of emissions is not reduced at all. It is merely moved to a different country. We saw this with the EU's cap-and-trade policy when this was introduced years ago. Actually, it just increased emissions in Asia because a lot of the industries within Europe simply got moved to Asia. Now on to my third and final substantive, why developing countries have a lot to contribute in the fight against climate change. So the fact of the matter is that climate change disproportionately affects poor countries. If you ask yourself the question, which countries in the world are the most polluted, they're most likely to be the ones which are poorer. For example, Beijing used to be one of the most polluted cities in the world. But the fact is that because it's so polluted, there are more likely to be innovations out of Beijing because people in Beijing see climate change as a massive problem, and therefore there's more research innovation coming out of Beijing to address things like climate change. And you see now, maybe 5 years later, Beijing is no longer the most polluted city in the world. It's actually far cleaner. So in that sense, poorer countries have a lot to contribute in terms of innovation, and for all these reasons, I'm very, very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Andrew. Question for Andrew? Yes, go ahead.
So when you asked about the economic advantage that developed nations do, you realize that the developed nations still have a far higher economic advantage when it comes to production because they have access to greater technologies and better infrastructure. So if you place the burden of, say, enhancing your factories for climate change on the poorer nations, they then come under a huge disadvantage compared to the wealthy nations. So don't you think that the wealthy nations thus have a higher responsibility and have a higher chance of changing without giving up a comparative advantage in the economic advantage as you speak?
I think it is true. It is not to say that that wealthy nations have no burden to reduce their emissions or in the fight against climate change. But the fact is, simply, it is not enough simply for wealthy nations to participate in the fight against climate change. If only wealthy nations take part in the fight against climate change, right, you'll continue to have bushfires in Australia. You'll continue to see low-lying islands being flooded and people drowning, right? The scale of the problem is immense, which means that everyone needs to be involved, not only wealthy nations.
You establish that wealthy nations are at fault for pollution because they've exported all of their production to developing countries, and then in the next sentence say that we ought not put the responsibility upon wealthy nations because otherwise they'll export all of their production to developing countries. What is it? Do we currently produce in developed countries, or do we not?
So I think the thing is that you need consistent standards across all countries, right? So no longer are these polluting industries simply moved to developing nations. You set really strict standards in all nations, which means that all nations are forced to adopt and implement efficient technologies instead of it just being moved from one country to another.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. And of course, the opposition has come up with the argument that we anticipated, and of course, very strongly pointing out that both smoke and polluted waters do not follow geographical boundaries and do not flow in the direction from poor to rich or rich to poor. They traverse the globe and occupy a space around 360 degrees of our wonderful planet. Right. Second speaker, speaking in favor of the motion, ironically from the same university, Carrie Goodsall.
Let's be quite clear. Wealthy nations have overwhelmingly been the cause of climate change, benefited from said climate change, and will be affected by climate change. It is their problem first and foremost. One broad claim in this speech: why wealthy nations have an overwhelming obligation to tackle climate change first and foremost, more so than other countries. I'm going to go over some of the same materials as my first speaker, but I'm going to look at greater detail and look at different mechanisms by which this takes place. Firstly, on the moral obligation. I think the first thing to note is that wealthy countries have predominantly caused climate change through historical emissions. And the important thing to note here is that emissions are both irreversible and cumulative. That is to say, emissions in the 1800s are still affecting climate change right now. They are currently contributing to said climate change. I think the second thing to note is that through colonialism and neocolonialism and imperialism, wealthy countries have wreaked systemic damage on ecosystems throughout the globe, taking natural resources and exploiting countries in a way that's been detrimental to climate change. More recently, they've been responsible for offshoring. Now, the response from opposition is, offshoring will get worse, and we should have consistent standards. Here's the thing, Andrew. The way you get consistent standards is by having wealthy countries taking the lead in creating the consistent standards, because they're the ones in control of the international political and economic institutes of global governance. We get those standards on our side of the house. I think as a result of this, wealthy countries have a principle of reciprocity that because of the damage that they've wreaked upon the globe, they should be the ones to tackle it first. I think the second reason why they have a moral obligation is insofar as wealthy countries have benefited from climate change in the past. For being able to use industrialization, they've been able to become wealthy before other countries, achieving that competitive advantage that Andrew wants to talk about. I think it's now unconscionable for wealthy countries to try and pull up that ladder behind them, to take away the advantage that they themselves previously had in order to preserve their own economic standing. I think it's unconscionable to perpetuate poverty throughout the globe. But I think the third thing is insofar as they have the greatest ability to mitigate that problem. And I think this is the case for a number of reasons. I think the first thing is that they have the capacity to make the trade-off between economic growth and tackling climate change that other countries, because of more pressing problems like dealing with poverty, are unable to make. But I think the second reason, this is a quite important reason, tackling climate change is an international problem that requires cooperation between other countries. And the crucial thing here is the institutions of global political and economic governance are dominated by the wealthy countries that hold veto power over those institutions. Through institutions like the IMF, like the World Bank, where countries like the US have a veto over policy changes. It is only by getting wealthy countries to take the lead, to take the moral burden, that you are able to ensure international cooperation on tackling climate change. We get that on our side of the house. But lastly, insofar as why developed countries are harmed by climate change and therefore have an obligation to deal with it. I think this is quite crucial. I think there's a number of reasons. I think first, insofar as you have rising sea levels and the acidification of oceans, which harms countries throughout the world, like the Netherlands and like cities like New York, for instance, I think that affects them predominantly. I think also in terms of changing seasonal patterns, for instance, which upsets agricultural communities throughout the world. I think that also has an impact in terms of climate migration, which will affect richer countries disproportionately. I think also insofar as you like to get greater geopolitical conflict as a result of climate change that affects wealthy countries especially. So insofar as if you have the melting of the Arctic ice caps, that's likely to cause conflict over the raw materials within the Arctic Circle that again affects developed countries. But at a more primal level, you have an existential threat facing developed countries as a result of extreme weather events. I think what we get from my speech is this. Developed countries have the capacity to deal with this problem more than any other countries do in this world. And they have an obligation to their own citizens to deal with this problem, and they have an obligation to the rest of the world as a result. I have never been prouder to propose.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Questions? Quick question? Yes?
Both you and your first speaker have alluded to the fact that developed countries or wealthy countries have the largest responsibility. Within that, have you not made the concession that non-developed countries or less wealthy countries also have some degree of responsibility to tackling climate change?
Sure. Climate change is a problem that affects all countries, but it's a problem that affects richer countries disproportionately, but more importantly, it is a problem that rich countries have to face up to and tackle more than any other country in that world. This is the burden that we stand for on side government.
Okay.
Kerry, even if wealthy nations have a moral obligation, do you think it is realistic for the US to reduce their emissions while China continues to pollute?
Let's be quite clear. rich countries have already accepted the burden of tackling climate emissions most. The Kyoto Protocol, which established Annex 1 and Annex 2 countries. The Copenhagen Agreement, which led to $100 billion of aid for developing countries to tackle climate change. And the Paris Agreement, which, for the exception of the US, has allowed for richer countries to tackle climate change more than any other country. Richer countries have already accepted their moral burden. They know it to be the case, they understand it to be the case, and they will continue to do so in the future.
Thank you very much. I think we have a very interesting angle added to the debate, buy-side proposition, which is they've extended the geographical argument to a very important historical argument, which is that when the rich nations became rich, so when James Watt found his teapot over boiling, that was a time when we didn't have this concentration of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And so there was nothing wrong to have an engine which consumed all your charcoal and emitted black fumes all over your cities. It was considered progress. And those countries that historically became rich at that time and remain the richer countries of today blame the countries that now try to seek to repeat that experiment and become more industrialized and, i.e., more richer. And therefore, this historical perspective is a new perspective that the proposition has put into the argument, and of course felt that history and geography means that it also provides a moral obligation to the people who have got richer quicker, earlier, by the same bad, unhealthy environmental means. Just a point to think about as we ask the second speaker from Jadavpur University, Abhiraj Goswami, to come up and tell us why he doesn't agree that rich nations are responsible.
Right, so a debate on climate change is like discussing the political discourse in India. The top strata don't think they need to discuss it until some celebrity walks into the scene, and the bottom strata is the real victim and they are ignored throughout the process. That is exactly what has happened till now in this debate. All of the arguments run by the side proposition speaks of one thing and reeks of one thing, and that is extreme privilege. They are telling you that they are the only people who can come up and solve a crisis that they themselves invented. Now, this is where the crux of our argumentation lies. We have to understand, and we break this down from the motion itself. The motion says that climate change is a problem of wealthy nations. Now, let us take one important factor from the motion, and that is a problem itself, right? So, how do we define this problem? For us, for nations that are developing, for the LDCs, without going into further academic terms, the LDCs and the non-wealthy nations, for them, climate change is about living, it's about surviving, it's about the future, it's about seeing their children grow, it's about seeing people go to school the next day, or the next decade, or the next century for that matter. But then, the motion is framed in such a way that people, like at least to the privileged individuals who are running this motion, to them it's just another problem. It's like transportation, it's like freebies on buses, it's like any of those problems, which is not the case. The real problem that we have to address on this side is the fact that climate change is existential, and that is what we are going to run on our side of the house. Now we have to understand that climate change firstly is not a problem of the wealthy nations. It's a problem of all nations everywhere in the world. But why I say not exclusively a problem of the wealthy nations is because the real victims of climate change are not the people in the wealthy nations, or not the majoritarian populations in the wealthy nations. It is those people who are coming from the nations of Africa, the nations of Southeast Asia and other countries wherein they do not have breakout capabilities, and that is something that we have to discuss as a matter of fact in this debate, now that they have come up twice and told you that only they have the capacity to solve climate change. Let's go ahead and dissect this again. Let's understand that richer countries, and what is this breakout capability we're talking about? It's very simple. All of these countries, these so-called rich countries, they have industrialized for decades and decades, and they have come to a point wherein if they wish to, for a period, a short period, period, which in this case is 10 years, what they can do is they can switch to green energy, just like that. They can switch from coal to tidal waves or something like that. However, the only thing that makes tides in a poor country is poverty itself. And that will not allow these countries to switch to these technologies. They have to come up to a certain level of industrialization to actually switch. And that is something this side of the house will absolutely not take into account. They will only keep saying that it is a problem, or they have taken up the burden that they have caused the problem, and now they have taken up the burden that they wish to solve it themselves, and that's it. That's where their argument ends. But that is not the case. Now we have to understand also the fact that with the breakout capability comes the entire idea of tearing down this motion further, because we have to understand that if we take into account the idea of wealthy nations, not all populations in these wealthy nations itself are safe from climate change. There are marginalized sections, there are geographical disparities in these wealthy nations itself. And these populations are also not safe. So essentially, if they're saying it's just a wealthy nation problem, they're wrong on so many levels, and they don't even know it. They haven't realized it yet. Now, with regard to that, if they take into account the fact that only they have the solutions to climate change, that doesn't work. Because again, they're negating an entire discourse that can take place in this very area, and they are negating an entire majority of the population of the world that should have a say, and that should have a louder say with regard to climate change, because they are the people who are suffering and who will suffer when these countries go out and grab their breakout technologies and just dump the blame and dump all of it onto these developing nations. Now, going by that, policy priorities, they will argue, is not something that climate change should not encompass climate change for a developing country. They should encompass jobs, they should encompass things like growth, development, but that is not the case. Because again, now when we have a level of awareness, when we have news and media, when we have somebody like Greta Thunberg going ahead and shouting their lungs out in the United Nations about climate change, we have to understand that these countries are also realizing that they are a bigger part of the solution. And how are they a bigger part of the solution? Simply by the game of numbers. They have greater populations who are at risk, they have greater populations who can be a part of the workforce, and they have greater populations who can save this planet from climate change. And the last thing I want to put forward is a simple example. Think of a hurricane. Think of a hurricane affecting the coast, let's say the east coast of New York, and let's say the coast of Chennai. Where would people die more? Where would media coverage...
You need to wind up, I'm afraid.
Yes. Where would media coverage be greater?
And down.
And where would property damage exceed limits beyond expectations? The answer is something that is very, very visible in the room from your silence. And with that, I rest my case. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhiraj. Yes, yes, why don't you ask the question first?
If it is true, as you claim, that countries have to reach a certain level of industrialization in order to implement green technologies, wouldn't that imply that we should wait for poorer countries to become wealthier before giving them the responsibility of adopting those green technologies?
All right. Essentially, again, that is where they negate their entire stance of, oh, we the privileged countries have the entire idea of solving climate change in the first place. Which of your privileged countries are actually coming up and sticking to the same doctrines and documentations that you uphold or claim to uphold in the United Nations? Where are you giving the chance to countries like ours to actually go ahead and take the fight forward? Where is that happening? And of course, nowadays, the entire idea of industrialization does not have to correlate or collude with the fact that we have to survive exactly on coal, we have to survive exactly on these forms of energy which can pollute the climate to that an extent. That is not the case right now. Technology has improved. Technology has become better. Look at the city of Kolkata. We are a part of a country that is becoming developed. We are in the process. But look at the green technology we are using. Look at the green technology, the green farms in southern India. Look at all the progress we are making. And this progress is what we are selling to you on our side of the house, and they will absolutely ignore, because apparently we're not a part of the solution anyway, right?
Thank you. Thank you. I think you've exhausted your entire 2 minutes, and therefore we can't allow another question. So I think the opposition has now done rather efficiently what we call democratization of the problem. You know what is democratization of a problem? It's to say it depends on numbers. So the number of people that will be affected by climate change are much more in the not so rich countries, and therefore the problem must lie with the not so rich countries. That's called democratization of the problem. It doesn't though mean that if you talk longer, you will be given more marks. So we will limit the democratization to that point. As we invite Panya Jagtiani from IIMC to speak in favor of the motion.
Good afternoon to one and all present here. I will be speaking for the motion that climate change is indeed a problem of the wealthy nations. So right now the prevalent argument is that since wealthy nations can attribute their riches to the Industrial Revolution that happened around 150 years ago, and since Industrial Revolution is when we essentially started burning fossil fuels on a large scale, which caused the large-scale emissions of carbon dioxide, causing temperature rising, and the consequences that we all face today, wealthy or otherwise, human species or not. So I do not think this argument is very tenable, because if we scale it down to an individual level, and I ask all of you here, can you be held liable for the actions of, say, your first cousin, let alone your ancestors and what they did 150 years ago? I'm pretty sure all of you will say, no, we cannot be held liable. Because if something that happened in a place and time that is not in your control, how can you be held accountable for that? But if I asked you the same question, that if there were events that happened due to, say, your core beliefs and principles, can you be held accountable for the same? And I think the answer to that is yes, we can be. So through the course of my argument, I would like to explore where the root cause of climate change is, and if it does indeed lie with wealthy nations, I think the onus is on them to rectify the problem of climate change. Right. So in order to understand where the core issue of climate change lies, we have to travel back 150 years to the era of Industrial Revolution. So it essentially started when a bunch of individuals invested in capital, both land and machinery, to mass produce goods. And they soon realized that in order to get good returns on their capital, they had to have sustained demand. The issue that they faced here was not so much about production and capacity and technology. It was more so about convincing people that they had an inherent need for the goods that were produced. So a lot of literature during the time of Industrial Revolution was about convincing people that they had a need for the goods that were produced. And the messaging was along the line showing people of the correlationship between economic status and well-being. So people fed into this belief because, as we know, that it is to some extent related until it is not, until the law of diminishing return kicks in and economic activity does not have much to do with our well-being. Fast forward to today, and we see that companies are doing exactly the same. In order to turn profits, they're convincing you that that you need to maintain a certain lifestyle. And this is what has led to one of the most diabolical principles of today, or in other words, consumerism. So what is consumerism? It is essentially the principle that that in order to be happy and for your well-being, you need to maintain certain symbols of status, like your clothes, cars, phones, etc. And a lot of the parties on both sides of the house have focused more on the production and supply side of the factors of production, rather than actually looking at the core of the problem, which happens to be the demand which is fueling the issue of climate change. So, because if we actually look at it, if we look at the production side of the issue, we say that wealthier nations have the capability, they have the efficiencies to come up with better factors of production, but that is not really the case, because we say that, okay, 30% of emissions are caused by, say, electricity. And then we look at band-aid solutions for that. So we say, okay, let us explore solar, let us explore wind, let us explore nuclear. But we already know that there are so many issues with these as well. So with solar and wind, we know that we do not have the capacity to store this kind of energy. So we look for battery solutions. And again, we know this is taxing the environment as a whole. So this is not really a tenable solution anyway. So my question is this our only eventuality? Are we doomed to this fate where climate change is inevitable?
I don't think so, because time and again there have been nations like, say, Bhutan and, say, the smaller island nations, which have shown us that happiness and well-being has very little to do with economic activity. So rather it is community living, it is sustainable growth and potential and human potential beyond economic activities, which should be the core values of all human beings in general. And so here I do not speak of, say, the economic liability that wealthy nations have towards us, which, to be precise, is around $500 billion if we are talking in terms of numbers. But I think it is more a sense of moral responsibility, because they have propagated ideals that have created the current world order, which is the consequences that all of us are bearing right now. So my only plea and hope to the wealthy nations is that they squash the very ideals on which climate change is actually the core of the problem.
Thank you very much. Can we have a quick question? Yes, for Presidency University.
Ma'am, when you ask the question that why should the present generation be held accountable for the actions of their forefathers, do you imply that we should waive off all accountability of all states for their past historical actions?
No, I do not believe that is true, but I feel a person is tends to do more from their own side, is more accountable when they actually directly feel responsible for their actions. So no, they cannot be waived off that responsibility, but you tend to do more from your side if you can see a direct connection between your principles and the consequences of the same.
Yes.
Following up on that, if my dad stole something from your father and passed it down to me, saying that I took it as inheritance, who does the item belong to?
So this is more of a philosophical question, but I think if we have to get to the practicality of it, like, we have to understand that the entire debate lies on the core of the problem, which is about consumerism. I don't think.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that's a question that we've been asking for years with respect to the Kohinoor diamond. Speaking against the motion from Presidency University, Sujata Datta.
Ladies and gentlemen, understand that we are enduring a global catastrophe right now, right? There's a fire breaking out in Australia where animals are dying. The Amazon was burning in the past few months, right? Global ice caps are melting. There are floods in Indonesia which are killing millions of people. And so when Shinjini comes up here and asks, what if the rich can pay for clean water? We are left to wonder, how do you pay for clean water if there is no clean water, right? So on their side, they come up here and talk about a colonial history, right? How the wealthy nations have been responsible for the larger part of emissions throughout history. It is important and it is important to understand here, ladies and gentlemen, that the colonial history is also a global history, right? Just because the wealthy nations went out there, broke down indigenous systems of conservation, introduced systems of exploitation of environmental resources, is all the more reason why this is a problem of developing nations as well, because most of that exploitation happened in third world nations, which were then colonies of these wealthy nations, right? So it is not only a problem of the wealthy nation, it's a global problem on a large scale, and everyone has an equal stake and responsibility in it, right? Moving to my second substantive, which is that the shifting of responsibility to third world nations, right? So when Carrie here comes up and tells that how first world nations dominate the economic and political institutions currently, we tell you that it is problematic to go on with that particular status quo, right? Because it inherently allows in the danger of allowing the developed countries to control the discourse about environmental conservation, right? And whenever you go ahead and allow the developed countries, the wealthy nations in the world, to control this discourse about environmental conservation, it always pans out into a conflict about who is contributing more and who is contributing less, right? Who is emitting more and who is controlling their environmental pollutions to a greater extent, right? So, however, it has been seen by historical examples that in the United Nations, whenever a resolution regarding the protection of environment has come up, the third world nations have always pitched in for international cooperations, right? And the reason is simple, because nations like Sri Lanka, like Bangladesh, like India, they need new technologies, right? They are at the risk of being flooded. They are at the risk of rising temperatures. Right? A few weeks back, Delhi was actually experiencing unprecedented temperatures. And we also see that in summer when the temperatures rise up. So third world nations have a greater stake in this whole problem of environmental pollution and of climate change, right? And that is why it is also a problem of them, and not only limited to the wealthy nations. And when you say that the problem is limited to wealthy nations, and they are the ones who should act because they are in charge of the most eminent institutions of political and economic action, you essentially put them in control of the whole discourse about environmental conservation, which then leaves out the voices of the third world nations. I think that was actually the democratization that Obiraj was talking about in his last speech, right? And so there's a shifting of responsibility to the third world nations as whole. That third world nations should plant more trees, they should go for greener pastures. That's the reason a number of green companies come into third world nations with their own systems of actually promoting consumerism and exploitation. What we are fighting here, ladies and gentlemen, understand, is big bad capital at its best, right? There's a whole shifting of responsibility to the third world nation when you say that it's only a problem of the wealthy nation, because they can easily wave off that problem and find their way around it by skewering it into a scenario where the third world is like contributing more to the damage of the environment, right? And moving forward, let's talk about the economic impact on the poorer countries. Understand that the economic impact of environmental pollution, the economic impact of climate change is disproportionately greater on the poorer countries, right? And why not? If you see the third world countries, most of the developing countries, geographically they are located at more vulnerable positions. They are clustered in Asia, in Africa. So these are places where a little rise in temperature and a little fall in temperature can cause a whole lot of distress, right? It can lead to lower labor productivity. It can also lead to lower agricultural productivity and lower agricultural yields. So it affects poorer countries disproportionately in that way. From 1961 to 2000, Stanford research actually found this out, that from 1961 to 2010, the whole of emissions that took place during these whole years actually brought down the GDP of all the poorer countries in the world by a collective 13%, which in turn increased the gap between the rich and the poor countries by a further 25%, right? So when you talk about the effect that environmental pollution has on countries of the world, it is the poorer countries who are affected much greatly by the environmental pollution and by climate change as a whole, than the wealthy nations who actually have the technology to deal with it, which again is something that the poorer countries, that the third world nations need right now in this world, right? And for all these reasons, I'm proud to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Shujato. Questions? Yes.
Terrific speech, Shujato, but one question. What do you think, among all the different causes that people in marginalized communities suffer from, are there things other than environmental causes that affect them? And how do you rank order these priorities? Other than environmental pollution, what are the other things that affect them? And how do you rank order these priorities in a developing country? What's your metric?
Right. So I don't think that environment pollution is the only problem on the list of why marginalized people are affected. There are, of course, a lot of other problems: unemployment, the rich-poor economic divide, stuff like that, right? So if you have to rank them in order of socioeconomic priorities in the perspective of a developing world, right? So the thing that happens is that the socioeconomic priorities of our developing nations are supposed to override the priorities of looking after the environment. The point is that we have reached a historical stage where the well-being of the environment is directly proportional to the socioeconomic priorities that the poorer countries have. The example that I right now gave, if there are low agricultural yields, if there are low labor productivity, the section most affected by it are the marginalized sections of these poorer countries, right? So if there cannot, I don't think there can be this sort of ranking where you actually rank socioeconomic priorities, then you rank environmental priorities, because they are interrelated and mutually affect each other.
Okay. Yes.
So when you started your speech, you said that when we take the wealthier countries responsible for climate change, we remove the less fortunate countries from the discourse. So when I switch this narrative, as many speakers have from your side alluded that wealthier nations are historically responsible. So when you make it our problem, don't you think the side which caused the problem is now not a part of your discourse in your own argument?
So when I said I clearly talked about an international cooperation by the whole community, and the third world nations have actually gone on, and whenever there has been a discussion in the United Nations, countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, Nepal and India, they have actually pushed forward for resolutions which recommended international cooperation on the issue, and not, of course, making a blunder and leaving out the United States of America, because that's not what anyone is talking about here. What we are talking about is equal responsibility and equal action to recognize the fact that it is an equal global catastrophe and problem for all the nations. Thank you.
Fourth speaker, Soham Chakravarti from Jadavpur University. And just another little advisory has come to me from our team monitoring the audio-visual proceedings for the day. You will not be heard louder if you speak closer to the microphone. You will be heard less. So do not go very close to the microphone with your oral cavity.
Lot of talk of privilege has been flying around in this debate. A lot of talk of how, this side of the house is privileged. Calm down, we are all privileged. The reason why we can sit in this room and debate this topic peacefully, where there are no goons out here to destroy this college, is because we are all privileged and we are not disrupting status quo with this debate. This debate in no manner will disrupt status quo in our country, while there are individuals who are getting beaten up in jails and put in jails, while kids in libraries studying are getting hurt. We are debating this because we are privileged. Let's first get that out of the equation, where where Abhiraj tried to point out that how we are privileged. But now let's come to what this debate is not about. This debate is not about whether climate change affects all countries. It does. This is a matter of scientific fact that can't be debated in this room, where I can't come up with alternate scientific facts, right? It's true that climate change affects all countries. Then what is this debate essentially about? Then this debate is essentially about which side of this house, whether it's the developed world or whether it's the developed world plus the developing world, which can solve the problem, right? For that, let's take one simple guiding line, which is the IPCC framework. What does the IPCC framework say? That in the next 100 years, we have to limit climate change and the temperature changes to 2 degrees Celsius and below. We are already at 1.5. What year is this? 2020. We are not going to hit that target. What was the prescription of IPCC when they gave this 2-degree target? They said that not only is it going to be enough for us to have carbon neutral emissions, which means that we account for all the carbon emissions that we are making, and we put enough oxygen into the air. It's not going to be enough to do that. We have to go ahead and be carbon negative, which means we have to literally suck coal dust, we have to suck soot, we have to suck pollutants out of the air, so that we have to suck greenhouse gases out of the air so that we can maintain temperatures, right? That's what the IPCC said. Which countries in the world are capable of solving this problem? Is it going to be India? Is it going to be Malaysia? Is it going to be Bangladesh? Or is it going to be the United States of America? Think about it logically, because perspective is missing in this debate. We all assume that clean air is very important. I agree, clean air is really important. But people who breathe clean air also die. You know why? Because they are poor. Because they don't have jobs. And jobs come from industrialization. No alternate argument has come from that side of the house. Don't be under the illusion that they have presented an alternate economy of living, where we are going to skip industrialization and still create jobs. That idea has not come from that side of the house, because they can't, right? Which is why what they've done is frame this debate in terms of who cares more. Do I care or do they care? That's not what this debate is about. You can care about the environment. People in the global south can care about the environment, but we should not implement policies that are going to destroy our economy. Let's take a simple example. What's a simple example in a country like ours, right? Greta Thunberg is associated with this organization called Extinction Rebellion. One of their policy prescriptions for every state in the world is that there should be no public transport. I am not kidding. Go look up Greta Thunberg's association with Extinction Rebellion. There should not be railways. There should not be aeroplanes. They should not exist anymore. Why is this important? This is important because when you apply these principles in economies like ours, fragile economies as they are, like this
thing has happened. 4.5 we are at. This has happened. So in that fragile economy, when you go ahead and implement these corrosive proposals, what ends up happening is you make individuals less socially mobile. You make us a less aspirational country. And that cannot be allowed to happen, right? The arguments of moral blame have already been made in this debate. I'll not get into moral blame, right? But what I will get into is that there are, the reason why fossil fuels are used is because they are the cheapest form of energy possible to industrialize. That's the be-all and end-all of it. That's the reason why fossil fuels are used. If the markets had evolved another alternate which was cheaper, we would be using it right now because the market would have adopted it. That's important to understand. They do not give us a solution where we can go carbon negative by geoengineering our world, right? They don't give us these ideas. They also don't tell us what do they want in these climate change policies. They don't tell us, because if they go ahead and actually make that case, like the one of Extinction Rebellion, Greta Thunberg, they are going to lose this debate because those ideas are wildly unpopular among the public, and that's why green urban politics always happens in urban areas, while the rest of politics is usually based on class, based on other identifiers. The reason why people don't care, there's not a green party the green party that's winning here is, by the way, in West Bengal is not like, the environmentalist party. Why is the green, an NGO with the green label not winning in Bengal? The reason is because people care more about mother, soil, and human beings. It's really important to understand this, right? It's really important to understand. The opposition in this debate has a simple burden. Their simple burden is to come here and tell us what is their alternate world where they care about the environment, good on that, but when they implement that care into policy, what will that world look like? Until they make that case, which none of the speakers have done. They have only talked about where is moral blame, where is not moral blame. If they come to that, I could have rebutted. Unfortunately, I can't rebut arguments that have not already been made in this debate, right? And the last point that I'm going to make is, of course, something that I draw inspiration from the moderator, sir. Moderator, sir, talked about being balanced. He emphasized on the need to be balanced and how we as an institution have always been balanced. I think it's very important to be balanced, but you should weigh what the weight is on the other side. That's why I make the references I do. Thank you.
Questions for Soham? Don't tell me you've been left speechless.
So wealthy nations tend to have more stringent regulation and therefore tend to have more environmentally efficient production processes. Therefore, wouldn't introducing state-of-the-art emissions-reducing technology have a greater marginal impact in poorer nations?
What is firstly important to understand is that for the last 100 years, there have been treaties which talk about technology transfers. They have always promised to transfer technologies to the developing world, and they come with a condition. Remember, the idea that's coming is not original. This clause was put into WTO agreements. Remember that in globalist institution that wants everyone to globalize, open up their economies, have free markets, and if you do those things, we will give you some benefit. We will give you like the ability to stop your fields from burning. We'll give you that. That has never happened. We can't debate on hypotheticals that don't exist. The transfer of climate change technology is a non-existent and a non-starter thing to begin with.
Thank you, Soham. I somehow thought, I think he's finished his 2 minutes because he had a fairly long answer to a fairly short question. But there is no doubt that I thought Soham coming from, thank you, you can take your seat. I thought Soham coming from Jadavpur University would point out that the climate change that we are currently witnessing in this country is occurring in universities and libraries. I didn't anticipate that in demonstration of that he would also throw off his warm clothes during his speech. Speaking in favor of the motion, against the motion, Rashmika Banerjee from IMC.
Hi, I'm going to take a huge risk with my speech now and ask you guys a question. But I'm an alumni, so please be nice. How many of you have used plastic in the last 2 years? Just raise your hand. Okay, that's a fairly large number. And how many of you have donated any money to conservation and rehabilitation of turtles? those marine animals there? Okay, there's 1 and 2 and... Okay, and ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what the thing is with people who take accountability for their actions. Your plastic has definitely harmed some turtles in the recent past, but you're not necessarily going to do anything about it because you don't need to care. Very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very good evening to Chairperson, Sir, respected judges, members of the House, and my very worthy opponents. We've been talking a lot about the previous speaker asked who cares more, right? And I'm a management student, so I'm going to give you a very practical answer. The solution to this problem of climate change does not exist where I'm concerned. We are, I'm sorry, but doomed to this problem not being solved, right? But the motion that we're talking about today is whose problem is it, right? And my argument rests on 2 pillars. The first is that just because somebody caused the problem doesn't mean that it is their problem, that it is their problem and that they need to solve it. And I'll tell you why, right? This moral gap between actually causing a problem and solving it is something that the proposition has not addressed even once. You come here and tell me that just because I cause a problem, I have to solve it. And I say, okay, hey, we are sitting in this privileged room and talking about this morally utopic world where we expect wealthy nations to spend a large part of their money investing in something that doesn't affect them as much as it affects the other nations, right? Which is the poorer nations. And let me tell you why. They come up here and tell you that everyone is equally affected by climate change, but this is not true. Studies show that there is a 25% increase in the gap between the GDP per capita of the richer countries and the poorer countries, and this is because of climate change. There's also a study that shows that India would have done 31% better had it not been for climate change. This is very difficult to imagine, but it makes sense, right? Because if 51% of our country is working in agriculture and is dependent on the weather for their crops, when there's a flood or when there's an untimely drought or something like that, ladies and gentlemen, our economies are affected much, much more than those that rely on manufacturing, that rely on services. And this is why it doesn't make sense for us to run this moral argument and say, you guys caused the problem, so you guys spend so much money in solving it. They're not going to, right? And that is the very practical way to look at this, and that is something that we need to factor in. The second thing I'm going to tell you is that the reason they're not actually going to solve this problem, the reason Trump is going to keep walking out of these meetings, and we shouldn't be surprised at all, is, ladies and gentlemen, essentially the free rider principle. Now, after I went to IIM Calcutta, I started working in groups a lot, and I realized that, there were these people who were aiming for ranks. And I was with them in groups, and I realized that if there's a deadline coming up very soon, they stand to lose a lot more if we don't submit the assignment on time than I do, right? And that is why I knew that the assignment would always get submitted on time, because there'd be somebody there in the group who stands to lose a lot more from it if it doesn't get submitted. And that's exactly the case, ladies and gentlemen, with climate change. Let's talk a little bit about the solutions that pop culture has proposed to us, right? There are 2 things. Either one is that we can live like SpongeBob in a pineapple under the sea, and the other is that we can do as the Brits do, and we can colonize Martians. In both cases, ladies and gentlemen, it's the privileged people who are going to do these things, right? And that's exactly why I tell you that it's not so much a problem for them as it is for us. And that's why we're all going to keep looking at each other across from this dais and say, hey, it's your problem, and it's not mine. And this problem is going to keep floating around, because no wealthy nation is going to spend their limited resources in solving our problems unless we provide them an entire bed of oil under our soil. Thank you.
Thank you, Rashmika. Can we have questions? Yes, Gary?
In the Kyoto Protocol, in the Copenhagen Agreement, in the Paris Climate Agreement, developed countries have accepted the principle of differentiated responsibilities, that they should do more to tackle climate change than less developed countries. Why is this not the case going forward?
Ladies and gentlemen, let's accept, let's just explore why countries do as they do. We can't just say that there is this climate change problem that's happening in isolation, right? There are a lot of power dynamics between countries. And geopolitics is a very real thing. So when people say that, okay, fine, I'm going to do more for something, there are a lot of other reasons involved in that decision. And in very layman terms, you are playing to the galleries, right? So the reason why this is not going to go forward, moving ahead from here, is because you have very limited resources. Every country has limited resources, and it doesn't make sense for you to invest in something that doesn't directly impact your GDP. And the reason is that everyone wants votes, and the only way you can get votes, not the only way, but the one of the ways in which you can get votes is by increasing your country's GDP, and that's where the investment usually goes.
Thank you. There is time. Is there time for another quick question? Yes, there is. If there is a question. Believe it or not, there isn't. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I have to say that I loved, Rashmika, your statement that those who identify a problem do not need necessarily to solve it. Have you been speaking to our political leaders recently? In fact, across the board, I meant. In fact, you know, Rashmika comes from a fabulous institute, which I just had an opportunity to visit a few weeks ago. It has 7 lakes. Imagine how environmental friendly that institute must be. But when I went there, a change I found from when I've been there 10 years ago was there was only 3 very ugly ducklings in one of the lakes, and none of the lakes had any of the ducks that I'd seen 10 years ago. And I asked the director what happened to the ducks. And she said, the waters are so polluted, they died of pollution drinking this water. So having lots of water and lots of environment doesn't necessarily mean that you're really contributing to improving the environment. As a matter of fact, she talked about the price tag. Being a management student, I presume, she is very concerned about it. I don't know whether you know, but just for your information, what humanity and the species we know as Homo sapiens would need to spend in a year to cope with warming temperatures on this planet is a 140 billion US dollars. Sounds huge, but it is only 0.1% of the global GDP. That's all we need to spend to counter the threat that we face as a planet. Chaitanya Kejriwal from Oxford University to tell us what he feels about the environment and who is responsible.
Speaker, make no mistake, wealthy nations have created a global empire on the back of a sinking Kiribati, of a choking population of New Delhi, and of a dying sea population. This debate, unfortunately, will not be solved or will not solve any of the problems that face us. I am still going to try doing 3 things. 1, a framing that will try to resolve the huge difficulties we've had so far in recognizing whether this problem gets solved if we only blame developed nations or if we make all nations responsible. And then 2 claims. 1, a characterization of what problems actually mean, and I know this is a semantic claim, but unfortunately one that hasn't been made in this debate. And 2nd, a philosophical claim about what are principles of restitution and why does responsibility fall on wealthier nations. On the framing, I think there is a massive lack of exclusivity that either team so far have been able to demonstrate. So, what I mean by this is, even if we say each and every nation and each and every citizen is equally to blame for climate change, it is unclear that that will make the US not pull out of the Paris Agreement instead of remain within it. But similarly, even if we say that only the developed world or the wealthy nations or climate change is a problem for only wealthy nations, that doesn't mean that developing countries don't still have positive incentives to want to tackle climate
climate change. What I want to make from this framing observation is nothing is going to change on how developed states or developing states behave, because the reasons they are either trying to tackle climate change or not are quite independent of whether there is a moral blameworthiness that is placed on them. Having established that, the first semantic claim on what a characterization of problem means. I think everyone has used problem very loosely, and unfortunately, debating is an exercise where you need to have at least a common definition, otherwise the debate isn't really going to move forward because everyone is just talking about something not in contention with other people. So yes, trivially, it is a problem that everyone faces, much like our lives, that there is climate change. So everyone is going to be affected by it. But I think that is not the context in which problem can be understood fairly in this debate. Problem, rather, in this debate has to mean some notion of moral blameworthiness. That is, you have some sense of responsibility tagged onto you, or you are a cause for it. Now, they might say, well, developing countries currently are also a cause for it, and that might be where this debate lies, whether causes must always be historical, or do we look at modern trends. But the reason this is very important then, is it means all the stuff we've been hearing about how people in the developing world are also affected is quite irrelevant to the actual resolution of this motion. Because all we actually want to resolve is whom should we put moral blameworthiness on. It's unclear whether putting moral blameworthiness makes Trump tweet any more sensibly, but it is clear that when we're deciding whether or not it's a problem of only wealthy nations, we need to be putting that moral blameworthiness. That is what I'm going to endeavor to do in my final 2 minutes, which is a philosophical claim on restitution. I think there is no reason to believe that wealthy states, or why wealthy states are wealthy, is because they did anything better than other countries. Rather, I would posit, the creation of states themselves are oppressive structures that were done to protect those who already had capital and wealth. That is, they realized it would be safer for all rich people if we put a common government which had all control over violence and law building. But this doesn't just happen within states, this happens across states. And that is why the moral blameworthiness needs to be put solely on wealthy nations. My argument is, all accumulation of massive differences in wealth that wealthy nations currently have is a direct consequence of exploitation of natural resources in a way that has caused the harms that we see our climate suffer with. That means that it is their responsibility in the greatest sense to restore this. Why does this restitutive principle apply here? Because the principle we need to lead ourselves with is if there is an action that takes away something that should have ordinarily belonged to all people, and there is no reason to believe that all the goods like the atmosphere, like air, water, land, isn't or shouldn't be held for the public good of all people, it is a responsibility of those who arbitrarily take it away to then restore it to the position it would have otherwise been. This is the same principle we use when we try to compensate for theft. This is the same principle we need to use on a global scale, given that the formation of these states was illegitimate without consent, and given that the accumulation of wealth that they currently have is because of exploitation. These goods never belonged to the US or the UK. The fact that there are cross-border effects demonstrates that they have a duty to restore that which they unjustly took. That is why I am incredibly proud to propose.
Thank you, Chaitanya. I wasn't being very personal about the Kohinoor diamond. Right. Yes, we'd ask the lady to ask the question first.
You say that these countries have the responsibility to restore what they've taken. Who is implementing this responsibility? Who is overseeing the fact that this responsibility needs to be taken by these countries? Who's going to tell them what to do?
So I think, unfortunately, no side is going to create an institution that magically does what is the right thing that ought to be done. But I don't think debates are only ever going to be won on a practical mechanism. I think some debates do require a genuine value judgment of who moral blameworthiness should be applied to, and that is what I'm trying to do in this speech.
Yes?
Sure. Following on that observation, do the observers to a crime who do not take action when the crime is being committed also hold liability to the crime that has been committed? And if so, were the governments of places like Namibia also conducive to the crimes committed by the establishment of MNC factories within their states that therefore contributed to the climate change problem?
I have no problem having humanitarian responsibilities on all citizens when they observe crimes. However, I do think Namibia, when it is forced by economic oppression by the United States of America to accepting unfair terms, that is coercion, which is very different from being a passive or neutral observer, so it doesn't apply in this particular circumstance.
Thank you very much. We get to the closing speakers now of this debate. Speaking against the motion from the home team, Hamid Aziz.
A very good evening to the respected chairperson, honorable judges, members of the House, and of course my most worthy opponents. The topic that has been placed before us today reads, this House believes that climate change is a problem of wealthy nations. And I stand here as a member of the opposition to firstly negate the arguments that the proposition has put up and then to go on with my own arguments. Now to begin with, ladies and gentlemen, we tell you that if we ask wealthy nations to go and solve the effects of climate change in poor countries, we are in fact setting a very bad precedent. And the reason is because when these wealthy nations are forced to go on and solve the problems of these poorer countries, they will begin to manipulate the already limited resources available with these poorer countries for their own gain. Because you need to realize that you're in fact putting a burden on them to go and solve the problems of a country which anyway has limited resources, and the wealthy nation, in order to maximize its own benefit out of the situation, may go on and manipulate the resources available with them, make them go and sign treaties which may be detrimental to the already limited resources of these poorer countries in the long run, right? Now with this, I will go on and talk to you further about my own arguments. Now one of the speakers from the proposition came and talked to you about being carbon negative. Now, one of the main countries now that is carbon negative is Bhutan. And Bhutan is not a developed nation. The fact remains that Bhutan today understands that climate change is a problem that it as a country faces as well. It understands its responsibility towards trying to go and solve the problem, which is why it has gone on to recognize the responsibility and go and change its means of production, go and change the way the country is administered. And it is for that reason today that Bhutan has gone on to become a carbon negative country. And if that is what you're trying to achieve, you have considered a wealthy nation country that is going on to solve the problem of climate change. Now with this, let me go on to talk to you about something which is known as the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Now all over the world today, you have sustainable development coming up as a concept which is being implemented in nations across the world. Now, one of the questions that they asked about was, who cares more, right? That's the question that has been talked about throughout the debate. And the simple answer to that question is the person who's affected more. Now, when you have, let's say, USA and Brazil, and you have the entire environment of that area being degraded, the effects on USA and Brazil will be the same. But we tell you that the citizens of America are more adept or have more resources to go on to control those effects than the citizens of Brazil, because that country has more resources available with it. Today, if we tell you that America has to change the way the power sector of the country is run, America can easily go on and buy solar panels. They can go on and invest in tidal energy and so on and so forth. There are many ways in which they can totally reform the system. But other countries do not have those resources, right? These poor countries do not have those resources. They have to depend on coal. They have to use these resources, which may be detrimental to the environment, and then they have to go forward. And this is the reason why the concept of sustainable development has come in, because you need to nip the problem at the bud, right? Now, one of the questions which the proposition talked about or asked was, why don't you let the poor countries industrialize first and then go on and solve the problem? We tell you that that is fundamentally wrong, because we cannot allow a historic wrong that has taken place by these wealthy nations to be done by these poorer nations too. Because by doing that, we are in fact increasing the problem, because the wealthy nations have gone on to develop themselves by degrading the environment. If we allow these poor nations to do the same, we are in fact degrading the environment further. And therefore, it is very important to nip the problem at the bud, to arrest the problem by making them focus on sustainable development, by making them accept resources which are beneficial to the environment. And we tell you today that even in these developing nations, the problem is being understood. Today in Calcutta or across India, you've got organizations which are going on to talk about sustainable development. They're going on to talk about eco-friendly products. And that movement is gradually gathering steam. And if you want an example from that, you can take the example of the Ari Valley in Maharashtra, right? Where there was an entire movement by people across the state to stop the felling of trees for the construction of a flyover. And that in itself shows that developing nations as well as underdeveloped nations are understanding that climate change is a problem. This movement is becoming far and far more widespread. Because if we depend on these wealthy nations solutions to only solve the problem, we need to understand that that problem is not going to be solved. Climate change is a problem that affects each and every one of us. But the problem is that these developing nations and these underdeveloped nations are going to face the greater brunt of this because they do not have the resources to fight it. And secondly, even these underdeveloped nations are not totally aware of the problem of climate change, right? Now, if you look at, a state like Delhi, or a city like Delhi, right? Delhi is one of the most, most polluted cities in India right now. And why is it polluted? Because of stubble burning in Punjab and Haryana. Now, it isn't that the farmers don't know that they have other options available. It is because you don't have an incentive to give up stubble burning and take up eco-friendly methods, right? It is necessary for these poorer countries or these developing nations to incentivize the people to give up stubble burning and take up more eco-friendly products, right? Eco-friendly methods, right? And so long as stubble burning continues, the environment of the entire world is going to be affected, right? And which is why every year around November and December, you have Delhi with, non-breathable air. Today, if you talk of something like a COPD, a citizen in Britain can easily go to a hospital and get himself treated. In India, there's hardly any proper treatment available for COPD. I mean, if you look at it from the effects of ill or diseases that are caused by pollution, right? So we tell you that these countries do not have the resources, and it is essential for us to arrest the problem at the bud, make them go ahead in a way that will not only benefit the environment, but benefit them industrially as well, and help in the long-term and overall development and sustainable development of the country as well. Which is why we tell you that the responsibility is as important for these developing and underdeveloped countries as it is for the developed countries. Because we cannot have a situation in the world where only the developed countries do something and the underdeveloped countries do nothing about it. Because we are going to repeat a historical wrong.
You need to wind up.
And repeating the historical wrong is going to increase the problem in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamid. Questions? Yes, madam.
Hamid, you talk about a not wealthy nation like Bhutan, which has become carbon negative. Do you think that if instead of Bhutan, it was a wealthy nation like US, it would actually have more effect in the entire global climate change scenario?
It would have, but that's a utopian concept because US will never become carbon negative. They will never give up its own industrialization to go on and solve the problem. And if you're expecting this, you're only living in a utopian world, and climate change is going to be a bigger problem in the long run. And thank you for elucidating my point.
Funding for the SDGs comes largely from wealthy countries, for instance, through the Copenhagen Accords, who recognize they have a differentiated responsibility to help poor countries. If you tell countries they have equal responsibility, that funding goes away. You don't have sustainable development. Do you not agree?
So we are not just talking about funding. If you talk of any problem in the world, the funding obviously comes from the bigger countries. If you look at any global organization, you have the larger countries that are taking a leading role in this. Now, if you hold that as the only metric, you're going to understand that this problem is not going to be solved because you're talking of equal finances. When you talk of how the UN is run or any international organization is run, the wealthier countries or the bigger countries always have to take a lead in it. That does not mean that a smaller country does not have, let's say, as much of importance in the General Assembly as a bigger country does. What we are telling you right now is that the governments of these poorer countries have a great responsibility to go try and change the systems or the methods in which the administration of their country is run. They have to reform the entire organization of the country to see that sustainable development goals are achieved. And sustainable development goals are more popularized in these poorer countries right now. There are UN campaigns for that because they need to understand that these poorer countries are the ones that need to be educated. And therefore, we are very, very proud to oppose today's motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamid. I think it would be a disservice to my profession if I didn't point out that treatment of COPD does exist in Calcutta. What has changed is, before we would tell our patients who have COPD and who smoke in their cars, stop smoking in your car because the carbon monoxide level in your car will go up. Now we'll tell them it doesn't matter because if you step out of the car, it's higher. In fact, it is amazing how speakers today, all of whom have come out so vocally in their support of the environment, have unfailingly used idiomatic English, which is so supportive of destroying the environment. For example, the last speaker talked about various schemes that are available for sustaining development, but such schemes have gone up in steam. Talked about programs in the world that have been nipped in the bud. Why are we nipping buds and going up in steams in an environmental friendly debate? I always wonder. But that seems to be our mindset, or one that the English language has bestowed upon us. Speaking against the motion, in favor of the motion, Benjamin Huffney from Harvard University.
If you are an aspiring Swiggy driver, you can buy a new scooty for 30 to 40,000 rupees, as long as you're willing to buy a gas-guzzling scooty. Let's say you want to take on the burden of trying to solve climate change. Buying an electric scooty is 150,000 rupees, a cost unavailable to almost anybody who would ever consider becoming a scooty driver. And this isn't unique to Swiggy, and it's not unique to India. There are hundreds of millions of jobs held by individuals in developing countries that are dependent on systematically exploiting the climate, in areas from taxis and Uber drivers to manufacturing and overfishing. What we have to recognize then is that the cost of fighting climate change in developing countries is far too high to bear when we allow those developing countries to bear the brunt of the cost themselves. What I'm going to defend in this speech is not then that we somehow stop fighting climate change in developing countries, as opposition seems to suggest, but rather that the costs incurred when we fight climate change in developing countries ought to be borne by the countries who are responsible for creating those costs, and by the countries who have the wealth to be able to afford those costs without putting hundreds of millions of individuals into destitute poverty. Now, what I'm going to do in this speech is three things. First, I'm going to clarify what we stand for and what types of policies we're going to pursue under proposition. Second, I'm going to elaborate on why exactly these costs are so high, specifically in developing nations. And finally, I'm going to discuss why exactly this level of cost is the bright line, at which point we say that developing countries should not only take on a small part of the cost, but should literally pay nothing. But first, to clarify what exactly it is that we stand for. Because when we say that climate change is the problem of wealthy nations, what we really say is that it's their responsibility. That they are the ones who must incur whatever the costs are of undertaking such an activity. So of course we stand for activities that can be entirely done by wealthy nations. Things like carbon capture and storage technology, an incredibly expensive piece of technology that can be used to remove existing carbon dioxide from the air. We're happy to say that wealthy nations will pay for all of this. But we're also happy to talk about collaborative types of policies between wealthy nations and developing nations. Things like forcing Western companies to open up their green technology patents. So in India, for example, where millions of solar panels are being manufactured, they're owned by Western companies because the US owns all of the patents and the costs are ever increasing so that Western companies can make a profit. We're happy to say that Western companies will pay the costs, make less profit, in exchange for doing a better job of fighting climate change. We're happy to talk about things like Western companies subsidizing the cost of transitioning to green technologies in countries. For example, allowing Western nations to subsidize things like electric scooties so that the cost would be the same or less than buying a gas scooty. And we're happy to do things like taxing the imports of wealthy nations based on the level of pollution created in order to create those products so that consumers in wealthy nations are actually paying the true cost of their consumerism. But if we fail to do this, and if we fail to enact these policies in which we make wealthy nations pay the costs, what exactly will the costs be? Well, what we have to understand is that there is no alternative industry in many of those regions. There used to be. There used to be things like farming, sustainable fishing, and local garment makers. But the introduction of Western capital has changed that. Consider places like Bangladesh, for example, where Western companies entered, created large manufacturing companies that paid more money than local agriculture and paid more money than local garment industry, which meant that all of those businesses closed, all of the farmlands were built on top of with manufacturing facilities, and now there are monopolies, and there are no alternatives. You can't go back to farming, and you can't go back to local industry because the businesses no longer exist. They were pushed out by the West. The only way then that you're ever going to be able to transition to green technology is by incurring the cost of what would otherwise be the extreme poverty of every individual in these countries. Not just in places like India and Bangladesh, but in places, for example, like the Philippines, where fishing, which used to be the dominant sustainable industry, has since been destroyed by overfishing, again, from Western nations. And why is this cost far too high to bear for even $1? It's two reasons. One, there is a difference in priorities. Wealthy countries have already solved the majority of their economic issues. Climate change is now their #1 priority. That's no longer or not yet the case in the developing world, where things like malnutrition, starvation, and millions of people dying from curable diseases because there's insufficient money for adequate health care are going to kill far more people in the foreseeable future than climate change is going to. It makes sense for these nations to prioritize even the marginal $1 on fighting those issues at home rather than the far-off problems that were created by wealthy nations. For those reasons, proud to propose.
Thank you, Benjamin. Questions? Yes?
Do the governments of countries in which you have MNC factories get no money from the presence of such factories within these countries?
They obviously do get money, but to be honest, it's a tiny amount. Consider Ghana, for example, the dominant exporter of cocoa. Cocoa brings in more than $100 billion of revenue per year. Ghana receives about 60 million of that. The amount of money that they're generating is insignificant, and I would prefer that all of that money be spent on building up new local industries, fighting for things like higher wages, and working on more pressing issues like local health care.
Yes?
So you said that you would prefer all of these things, and we're playing this blame game, so we know who caused the climate change, right? But I'm going to ask you the same question I asked the previous person. Aside from us, who is really telling the United States what to do and ensuring that they do exactly what we tell them what to do?
I think you're considering a different debate right now. This isn't a debate about whether or not wealthy nations will take on the burden, whether or not they will take on their responsibility. It's a debate about whether or not that responsibility exists in the first place. I agree they've shirked it, and if you agree, then you're acknowledging that it's there in the first place. Thank you.
Time up, please.
Thank you very much. It's a shame that the 11th tablet handed over to Moses did not read, "Thou shalt not pollute." Can we ask Ishan Kapoor from Oxford University?
The problem with being the 12th speaker in any debate is that you run out of material and you run the risk of being incredibly repetitive. That was until Chaitanya and Ben came up and told me what they told me, and then I suddenly have a new constructive. So what I'm going to do in this speech is twofold. The first is I'm going to rebut the principled argument that comes out of Chaitanya, which is that a responsibility exists with developed countries because they created the problem and therefore have to take onus of that responsibility. As well as, and within this I will also tackle what Ben talks about in terms of costs, and the fact that costs, because the responsibility exists with developed countries, therefore the costs need to be transposed onto the developed countries themselves, and it is immoral for us to have the developing countries carry on their burden. The second thing I'm going to do is actually have a bit of fun with the motion, because Chaitanya says that, it is unlikely that any side of this motion is going to solve the problem. I'm going to prove that the only way by which you solve the problem is if you create a consciousness within developing countries that this problem exists and therefore push for collectivized action within these problems. So let's talk about the first one, about why a principled argument is not only lying with side proposition. Because the principled argument is one of restitutive justice. I am terrible at rebutting principled arguments, so I'm going to propose a counter principle here, which is the presence of a duty of care that rests with the governments of developed countries. And here's the cost argument, right? The cost argument by Ben says that MNCs have established themselves in developing countries and are piling up disproportionate amounts of profit going back to the developed countries, of which disproportionate amount and minimal amounts of gains are being reaped by the developing country itself. The problem with this is there is still a significant amount of money that flows into the pockets of bureaucrats within the developing countries simply by the presence of MNCs and factories within these companies. This is non-negligible. The point
point here being that because there is a steady stream of profit and there is the bystander effect, which was the interjection that I alluded to when I asked Chaitanya, the responsibility does not exist with the individual citizen of developing countries, but rather with governments who also stand to benefit by commercialization and by capitalism that is enforced on them by Western countries. The reason why this duty of care exists is because while the creation of states is an illegitimate, non-consensual process, you do get born into consensual structures of state and do consent to participating in the creation and the development of nations through processes such as voting, such as paying your taxes. And insofar as you have consented to state structures that are contributing actively to climate change, which is an existential problem of the masses, to that extent, states therefore have a duty to care, because each individual and collective masses of people, even though they cannot cognize the problem themselves, are facing the existential threat that both sides of the house agree to. So I'm going to concede that yes, Western countries and wealthy countries probably have a greater duty of care, but the duty of care is not insignificant within developing countries. Why then is there a mechanism to correct the harms that have been done only when you can increase the amount of cognizance that is present within developing countries? The first thing I'm going to establish is why there is an apathy to solving the problem within Western countries or within wealthy countries. 3 reasons beyond the reasons that have already been talked about by side opposition. The first is there is an increase in nationalist sentiments as seen by movements such as Brexit and by the appointment of Donald Trump, which means that Western countries are increasingly isolationist and unwilling to take on responsibility. The second is there is populist capture that is taking place, not just within wealthy countries, but also within developing countries such as Brazil, which leads to things that are commonly known as climate change deniers, and denial of climate change, which leads to an inertia of action within Western countries. The third is there is a lack of voter engagement, because both sides of the House have conceded to the fact that right now people who are disproportionately affected by the atrocities of climate change belong to developing countries themselves. For those reasons, because you cannot feel the tangible impacts of climate change, it is very unlikely for you to be able to galvanize masses on grounds of climate change other than Australia and New Zealand, because the Green Party doesn't do too well in the UK either. And because there is a lack of voter commitment to climate change issues, the incentive of governments and legislators to talk about climate change in Western countries, especially that doesn't affect them, such as climate change in Bangladesh and Myanmar, is very, very low. Why then is it possible to advocate for change through developing country consciousness? 3 reasons. The first is bilateral trade exists between developing and developed countries, in that Western countries do not have a monopoly of trade and are to some extent dependent on the production capacity of developing countries to funnel other things in. The second is that developing countries often form the sources of non-renewable resources that play a large role in the economies of developed countries. And the third is that developing countries now have a choice of bilateral negotiations with different countries whom they can align with. What this means is that developing countries, once they start taking consciousness of the problem and demonstrating exhaustion of their own resources in tackling the problem, can impose measures such as sanctions, such as trade tariffs, etc., on developed countries in order to tackle the issue itself. For all those reasons, beg to oppose.
Thank you. Yes? Question?
Ishan, developing countries already have incentives like making sure that citizens are able to breathe to try to tackle climate change. Why is it necessary to attribute any blameworthiness to them for them to now have additional incentives that they didn't already have?
It's not the necessity of attributing any blame to them. The point of this consciousness and the point of my argumentation is to show that by developing a consciousness, not through blameworthiness, but by taking some modicum of responsibility, you can pressurize those who have a larger burden of responsibility to start taking action, because their economies start tanking the second India imposes sanctions on the US for not tackling climate change. It is something that they have to reckon with, as opposed to the Paris Agreement, which is a consensual agreement.
Yeah.
Your initial principle is based on people consenting to state structures through things like taxes. The last time I checked, you can't consent to paying tax, and if you don't have capital, your ability to change states is incredibly limited. Given that, your principle is meaningless if you don't have meaningful consent.
Yeah, but you do have implicit consent, i.e. you can opt out of this consent if you want to by moving, because you can move to states like Russia where you have to pay less income tax. So you have implicit consent that is more so than the illegitimate principle that was brought by Chaitanya.
Thank you very much. I think that brings us to the last speaker speaking in favor of the motion. And the last speaker speaking in favor of the motion is from the home team, Yogesh Chaudhary.
Good evening, everyone. A problem with being the seventh speaker for side proposition is that all the arguments from our side have been said but one. And that argument is simple. That argument is that we can solve climate change. The technology to solve climate change does exist. The patents to solve climate change through carbon capture do exist, and they exist with the United States of America, with United Kingdom, and other wealthy nations. But before I go on to my arguments, I would like to inform you of who I am. And I, like many of you in the auditorium, am an Indian born after 2000. I represent a generation that had the least to do with climate change, but has the most to lose with climate change. In my country, in the next 10 years, more than 2 million people will die of dengue and malaria because of increasing heat due to climate change. One of you can be someone in this auditorium itself, though that's unlikely. 10 million people across the globe will die because of climate change. So that problem is real. And that problem is something that needs to be attributed to someone. And why is that? Because if we do not give responsibility to the nation that has caused this problem, there's no one who is going to solve it. The point over here is that this problem was caused by the wealthy nations, and yes, we, the poor nations, will help you out with it, but it is your problem to begin with. It is our essential argument over here that it's not that the pollution was caused 150 years ago or during the Industrial Revolution, but that the wealthy countries are still causing that pollution right now, even today. And that's where I bring out the corporate structure that lies within it, right? We talk about the top 8 most polluting companies. We talk about ExxonMobil. We talk about Gazprom. We talk about Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Nestle, Mondelez, Monsanto, and Saudi Aramco. 5 of these from this 8 list belong to the United States of America. So when we started this debate with how pollution is being outsourced, the truth is that the countries which still ask that there's no responsibility because we aren't the ones who are continuing with this problem, are actually causing this problem, and that needs to be addressed over here. During the second speaker, they asked that smoke does not value borders, right? But then why is it that people from Beijing, Delhi, and Kolkata are more likely to die out of air pollution than someone from London? It is simply because this problem affects us more. And that is not an argument that we should act first. Because if we are the ones who are being hit by the problem the most, act first, then how is it model for the developing nations who then build better technologies and have better argumentations so that they can then go on to pollute in different ways? The problem with climate change is that it is not a concept of economics. Because if we calculate the economics, as pointed out by the speaker, we see that the cost to stop climate change is much less than the damage that comes in. The problem over here is the thought process. The thought process is what matters. And that's where we come on the argument. That once we start attributing responsibility to the wealthy nations, once we say that you were responsible, that you are the ones who caused this industrialization, and you are the ones who are causing my generation to suffer right now, that is where you start taking responsibility. And I agree, you might not take responsibility now. There might always be a Donald Trump who backs out of that argument. But then, in that situation, when we attribute responsibility to the wealthy nations, it is in that time where we have climate change rallies across New York, across Atlanta, and that brings change because that brings more than an economic incentive, that brings a political incentive. And that is where the blame is attributable, and the blame benefits the climate change discourse. Because once we fix a blame on someone, that is where we can rise to the moral conscious and rise above the economics, because everyone from that side has alluded that economics is not going to solve climate change. So what's the answer? The answer is a political and a moral awakening of the people, and that can only be done when we attribute blame. So if you say that people from Bangladesh are dying, people from Bangladesh are not getting clean water, that is not because of the people and the government of Bangladesh, but that is because of the citizens of the United States of America. When the speaker asks you that if you have used plastic, she ignores the fact that United States of America per capita uses 16.5 metric tons. So everyone in the audience combined, that's less plastic than one person uses in United States of America. And that's a problem. Because when we talk about climate change, we ignore the historical bias, we ignore the moral rights, and we just go on to the argument that they will not accept it. Well, they will not accept it today, but they will accept it tomorrow if we start saying that it is your fault and you are to blame. And that is our argument in the crux of it, right? We talked about how the countries which need responsibility are the ones which hold the patents, they hold the technologies to solve it. But but they're not giving it away. So it's essentially that I invited you to my home, you burnt my house down, you went to your house is burning now, and you're asking me to pay for it. That does not make any sense, because the simple point is that you have the resources, you have the political will to solve the problem, and you are the countries which have the priorities ordered, so come to solve climate change. With that, I rest my motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. I think there are a few people that have questions for you, so maybe you need to return back to planet Earth.
So assume that today we start putting pressure on the United States. We make them feel really bad about what they, the United Kingdom, we make them feel really bad about what they did to our ancestors. And we do this for till as long as it takes, right? And you say that this blame is going to make them feel bad and give us something. So in what year approximately do you think they're going to give us the Kohinoor back and 1/4 of their GDP?
So the answer is simple. When people start coming out in protests, when people start coming out in rallies, that is when it happens. This year, the Labour Party actually gave it as an electoral promise that they will apologize for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, and that was because of the Indian diaspora there, right? That was something which happened because of political support. So when you ask the question that when will they return the Kohinoor or when will they tackle climate change, I asked you the simple answer is when people start coming out on the streets and say that yes, climate change is our priority, our ancestors caused it, we are causing it, and we need to solve it now.
Go on.
Where is there more political will to tackle climate change? In the US, where people care about Mexicans invading their borders, or in Bhutan, where people are dying because of the climate crisis?
So the point that people do not care is something which stops the argument, but I don't think that is true. Last year, the most searched word was how do we stop climate change? That was something which needs to be addressed, right? Everywhere across the border, we have discussions on climate change which were not there 15 years ago. Everywhere we talk about now, the issue, climate change is becoming more and more political. The point is that we need to start giving responsibility to the people and asking attributable benefits for that rather than saying that it won't happen. Because if nothing happens, then there's no point to entirety of the debate, right?
Thank you very much. I think that really brings us to the very, very last speaker of the debate today, Justin from Harvard University.
Panel, as I stand before you right now, the world is on fire and proposition wants to decide who should be responsible for the ashes. For all the empty rhetoric and the hollow promises made by proposition, what we've been missing so far is an actual characterization of how exactly apportioning blame based on colonization and historical wrongs actually incentivizes countries to make real policy changes and pursue the kinds of solutions that actually end the climate crisis. Unlike proposition, I'm not cynical about the prospect of solving climate change. It is very true that we might fail to meet the IPCC standards, and it's very true that we will suffer warming. But for every degree less that we pollute the planet, for every metric ton of carbon dioxide that decreases, we're able to make a difference. That fewer people in Jakarta will die from flooding, that fewer people in Australia will die from forest fires. I'm going to give you a very simple characterization of why it is likely that only our side of the house gives you a sufficient solution to climate change. But before that, I'm going to quickly respond to the idea of responsibility and guilt tripping being the solution to the problem. I think the answer to this is extraordinarily simple, which is that you can ask the people of Iraq and Afghanistan if blaming the United States for the historical problems of imperialism has actually made the West feel more responsible or engage more carefully in matters of foreign affairs, right? And I think it's very simple, which is that for all of their arguments about why it's true that protest and public attention will solve the problem, the reason, and itself pointed out by side proposition, is very simple, which is that at the point at which all the multinational corporations and ExxonMobil and Saudi Aramco are based in the rich countries that they're supposed to solve climate change, it's very much unlikely that the kinds of corporations and the kinds of countries they're trying to hold responsible are the ones likely to solve if they're already so politically captured. How then do we actually solve climate change on our side of the house? Firstly, I think there's a very simple argument for mathematics here. That is, that the more countries reduce emissions, the more emissions get reduced. Proposition wants to depend on the world's 20 richest countries to reduce climate change, and on our side of the house, we simply say you can't count on those countries, all the countries have to chip in. That is, by simple logic, the fact that 50 countries reducing emissions will probably make a larger impact on how the climate changes in the future than 10 countries reducing emissions. So even at their best, all proposition has done is prove that some countries may be responsible for more emissions than others. It doesn't beat the fundamental premise of the argument, which is that all countries need to participate. Secondly, though, I think the important characterization here is that all the countries that they expect to do such a great job solving climate change are the ones, as they correctly point out, saying that they must shoulder the blame right now and doing absolutely nothing. At the point at which an ExxonMobil CEO can sit on the United States President's cabinet, at the point at which the United States environmental protection agencies are run by oil lobbyists, it's very unlikely to me that the way you solve climate change is by depending on the countries that have repeatedly failed us in the past and will continue to do so in the future. What we propose then is that it's not about trying to get the countries that have repeatedly failed us to provide a solution. They've shown us that they can't do that, and they've shown us that they're unlikely to actually meaningfully care about the effects on people in the developing world. Rather, the solution to climate change, which both sides agree is a problem predominantly affecting those in the developing world, can only come from those in the developing world. Because these are the only people that actually care enough about climate change, that see the impacts on the ground, that see the forest fires, that see the flooding, that see the people dying on the streets from air pollution. And these are the only people who have the political will to mobilize a coherent opposition to the forces of multinational corporations, to the forces of political capture, to the forces of imperialism and colonization that proposition wants to talk so much about. What then is the actual comparative in this debate? Because I think we get some arguments out of proposition that sound nice, and they're largely along the lines of needing countries to develop first. But the problem with a development based on a faulty premise of using fossil fuels in air pollution is that it's fundamentally faulty. That is, for the same reasons that we regret industrialization and that proposition wants to tell you that the usage of fossil fuels is so bad, is exactly the reason why we ought not tell developing countries to take the same path to development. That is, that if it is true that climate change is bad for the economy and that it harms people living now and into the future, and it's a reason not just why developed countries should shoulder the burden, it's also a reason why developing countries that are trying to modernize their economies right now ought to find different paths and ought try to spend their efforts on sectors of the economy that actually result in better economic outcomes now and into the future. And I simply think it's a fiction that that proposition tells you that the only way to develop is through fossil fuels, right? Because as opposition has already told you, there are many countries in which the development of green technology has actually caused more economic growth. Literally, every single country that spends money on green tech sees massive returns on investment that create massively more jobs than the same amount of money spent in the fossil fuel sector. So maybe it is true, as proposition wants to tell you, that people are afraid of investing in fossil fuels. We tell you it's just a reason as to why those countries ought to shoulder the burden now and into the future. The motion falls. We're proud to oppose.
Thank you, Justin. I already see some hands up. Yes?
Side proposition agrees that all countries in the world need to be involved in fighting climate change by doing things like decreasing emissions. This isn't a debate over that. It's a question of who should foot the bill, the countries that have the money to afford it or the countries that don't.
I think that if you're waiting for the United States to subsidize developing countries to transition away from fossil fuels, you'll probably be waiting until the oceans rise enough to kill us all. Like, I actually just do believe that if you are trying to force developed countries to shoulder the blame, you end up with a political gridlock in which nothing actually ever happens and that no policies meaningfully get passed. You can't wait for the governments that are captured by ExxonMobil and oil corporations to take climate action because you'll be waiting until the oil companies literally go out of business, right? It's not sustainable to say that the countries that have historically done the worst job in combating climate change are the ones that we should wait for. We think developing nations ought to take the first step.
Any more questions? Yes, last question.
So you said that green technology could be a viable solution, but don't you think there are consequences of green technology that we do not know of yet, and we could be debating the same 150 years hence, like how we know about the consequences of fossil fuels? So is that really a viable solution that even developing nations should be looking into?
I think insofar as it's fairly widely documented that renewable energy has a substantially lower impact on the environment, then I do think it's the path forward. But even if it isn't, I say that developing countries ought at least attempt to find solutions that don't rely on developed countries' generosity, right? That is, that even if it is true that certain solutions to the climate catastrophe are unrealistic, then we ought to find ones that are more realistic. It's not a reason as to why we shouldn't ask developing countries to try and solve climate change. It's just a reason to look for better solutions.
Thank you very much. That really gets us to the end of the formal round of debating, and I think you'll all agree, irrespective of the answer to the question, who's going to foot the bill, this has been billed as a very, very charged and heated debate, and it has lived up to its complete expectations, irrespective of what we've done to the temperature of the atmosphere. It is customary to ask one person from each side to sum up the arguments of that side before you, the audience, cast your vote. And the teams have themselves chosen who's going to be summing up. And as per tradition, we will ask the leader, one of the team members from the opposition to sum up first. And summing up on behalf of the opposition is going to be Shujato Dotto from Presidency. Is that right? No? Who's going to do it? Okay. Obiraj Goswami from Jadavpur University has been bestowed upon that honor. In case you're wondering why the bell is not ringing, it is because the organizers have been so consumed by guilt hearing the speakers that they're doing their little bit to reduce carbon footprints. And instead we are just saying time.
Before I start, how much time do I have for the speech?
3 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Irrespective of whether you belong to a rich or poor country.
Right. So this debate has gone forward in one particular way, right? And this is what side proposition has told you. Now, let's go back to the 19th and the 20th centuries, right? There was the global question of who will be the global policeman enforcing what kind of global model of government. Right now, that question is who will be this global protector of the environment. And in both cases, side proposition wants to play one card, and that is the global policeman card, wherein the wealthier nations historically want to take the reins. And that is not something that we are allowing from our side of the house at all. Now, let's go over the arguments that they have put forward. They have gone ahead and saying things like, like climate change is inevitable, we may not be able to solve it at all. And let's start with Soham's argument. Of course, Soham puts forward a couple of points, but all of them are in isolation of a situation of crisis. Soham puts forward the entire argument of a Nash equilibrium, where we just go on and on until we hit a crisis, and then we have no idea what to do before or after that point, right? Then we go on to other arguments, like let's say the model of global citizenship as provided by Chaitanya. Now, how do we propose a model in which no problems are addressed rather than a model in which problems are classified and addressed on the basis of states? That is why we have this entire global model of individual democracies collectively existing at the same time in the first place, because all problems have to be addressed, and climate change is one of them. If we have a global citizenship model, climate change will not be an important issue, because historically traditional security has always been the most important issue. That being said, the global policeman problem is something that I already talked about. Why will we let a number of people who have already made a broken system police us further, breaking systems further, unless our countries cease to exist at all, until they gain complete monopoly over the situation? However, look at what we have proposed on our side of the house. We tell you how all problems like poverty, problems like a bad economy have something to do with the environment. And that is why all countries, including the developing countries, they are trying to understand, they're trying to restructure their economies, restructure their societies for greater sustainable living. That is what we are selling to you on our side of the house. We are selling things like collective action. We are selling you things, we are selling you ideas like the prevention of green imperialism, which would have happened if you again let these countries like the United States and the United Kingdom go ahead and police their way into what is sustainability, what is not, how do we do it and how do we not do it, all the while ignoring absolutely the stakeholders of the problem, which is primarily the third world countries. We give you the idea that collective consciousness has to be built. Collective consciousness is the only way wherein we can understand that there is a crisis and that this crisis has to be solved, and it has to be solved because each and everybody is affected by this problem. It is not a problem that only affects the wealthy nations. It is not a problem that can be solved by the wealthy nations. And why I say that is because historically, wealthy nations have never solved problems. They have always created them, leading us to more debates like this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Soham. Summing up for the proposition from the same university, Soham Chakravarti.
Recently, everyone on Facebook has been talking about chronology a lot. I don't know if you have noticed this, but it has been happening. Let's trace the chronology of this debate a little bit, right? What has happened is, first this side of the house, proposition, came forward and argued the moral imperative that the developed world has. The opposition to that was, correct, developed world has the primary burden, but they are unwilling to enforce it. So we all need to share that blame. That was the first response we got. Second, when we came here and argued about the economical impacts, which were very really fleshed out, right? We told you how is it that green technology, how is it that the environmental policies that are being proposed on the international fora today, how they're going to impact the economy, how they're going to impact labor-intensive nations like India, where it's just not about cost, it's also about the number of people those industries employ, right? Labor-intensive countries like India are going to be impacted differently than countries that don't rely on labor-intensive technologies and rely on capital-intensive technologies, right? We argued all of this. In response to this, what we got was, the United States and the French and the British, they have never done anything for the developing world, so they're never going to do anything about climate change, hence we win the debate. The third, when we came ahead and argued on the third front, that the developed world has already accepted the notion of common but differentiated responsibility through multiple conventions, through multiple legal routes. They came in and again argued, well, the United States is not going to do it, neither is the developed world. You notice something, that they have never argued why or in what possible way the developing world would do it. The developing world right now is not doing it because there are no incentives to implement green policies. That's the long and short of it, right? All of the argument of the last speaker that we heard from the other side of the house essentially boiled down to the idea, well, they aren't going to do it, are you going to do it? Unfortunately, I incidentally happen to be from this country. I also happen to know about what the people in different areas who practice politics feel. What is it? Are they really concerned about green politics, and is India implementing green policies? They are not, because there are other priorities in developing nations. So the idea that they can win this debate simply by showing that the Americans and the developed world are unlikely to do it, hence we win the debate, is really not a good argument, right? Because neither are we. What we have to debate here is the principle. Is the West, is the developed world, the global North, responsible for inflicting years upon years the great tragedies that have befallen the global South? Are they responsible? And if yes, how is it going to be borne out in the different responsibilities they have towards the environment? I say that the people in India, the people in the developing world need to get out of poverty through industrialization far faster than actually we are. We need to use more fossil fuels. We need to use more industrial technology so that we can go ahead and create jobs that are labor intensive, that produce jobs. If they can't come up with an alternative model...
Distress shouting time.
Yes. If they can't argue the opposite, they lose. Thank you.
Thank you, and really that has got us to the end of a fantastic debate. I think the judges need to confer amongst themselves and elect the winners. And in the meantime, you, the audience, have to do a major task. You have to vote for one side or the other. So once you've voted, we will then ask the two experts on the panel to come up and tell us a little bit about the debate, and finally we will have the judges to come up and share with us their emotions of this evening, and finally we will declare the results. Just in case by now you've lost sight of the motion, it is behind me and it reads, "This House believes that climate change is a problem of wealthy nations." Just to sum up what the side proposition has said, they have said this is absolutely true for reasons which are geographical, So if you're causing more pollutions by the aeroplanes, you're flying over JFK Airport, then you have to pay for pollution earlier than the pollution that is being caused by burning cow dung to cause their fires for the evening meal in the district of Purulia in Bengal. And you cannot ask that poor man in Purulia who's burning the cow dung to get a fire for his dinner to pay the same as those of you that are encircling JFK airports in your jets and contributing to the same environmental pollution. The other cause has been historical, which they've emphasized on from the proposition. That is, if your grandfather has stolen my grandfather's jewel and become rich, then don't ask me to pay for the ornament as much as you will pay. The third, of course, has been economic, and they've emphasized on the point that it costs a lot to clean the environment. And since you've caused more muck than we have, and you have a better bank balance than we have, you can hardly ask the poor countries to pay to clean the environment. And finally, of course, their argument has been the moral stance. You have more money. You have polluted the environment. You have burnt all your coal. You've even stolen some of ours and burnt it. Now you have enough money to build nuclear reactors. We cook our fires on cow dung fuel, and you want us to build nuclear reactors to cook our dinner. That somehow seems morally incorrect. The side opposition has responded to this by that philosophy of democratization that I talked to you about, saying the quantities come from the developing world. So if we are going to suffer because of rising temperatures and rising water levels, more people will be affected in the poorer countries than in the rich countries. And therefore, the poorer countries need to be involved as much as their rich cousins. In fact, they've gone on to also tell us the philosophy that if you are on an island and the water level is rising, you have more money, you should pay for the boat. And that's been their philosophy from this side. In fact, we had an impassioned speaker telling us about plastics and turtles. We had side opposition telling us that if you go to the United States and tell their leaders about plastics and turtles, then the only turtles they are concerned about are the ones that are written behind the T-shirts they wear. And it is very little chance that they would know about any creatures that live an aquatic life in other parts of this universe. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, the argument today has been basically a debate of quality. If you have the money and you've caused more damage, you should be doing the cleaning, versus one of quantity. If more people are affected, even if you don't have the money, you jolly well have to participate in the cleaning up process, because more people will die in your part of the world if you don't. And it's really been a debate of quantity versus quality. In fact, it is a debate where one side says that if you're being driven in your new Audi Sports along Red Road by your chauffeur, and your chauffeur opens the door and spits out onto the red road at the traffic light, you should get off that car and clean his spit. The opposition says, you shouldn't do that. You should teach first your chauffeur that he shouldn't spit on red road. And that's really been the arguments from the two sides. Right. I hope you're now ready to cast your vote, which means that you raise your right hand as I enunciate the motion again to you. This House believes that climate change is a problem of wealthy nations. Those who believe that side proposition carried the day today, please raise your right hand. Don't look around and don't be worried, and Father Dominic is not going to look who's raising his hand in which direction. That's why we strategically seated him on the front row, and as his neurosurgeon, I have told him not to move his neck too much. So, can we have a person to count these innumerable hands that I see raised in front of me? One. Okay, thank you. Shankar, you were always a businessman and can count your numbers well. What about those who feel that the side opposition has really carried the day and this motion does not have a stand? I'm afraid Pradeep Gupta has declined to count, which means it gives me great pleasure to announce that the motion before the House today has been defeated and that the opposition have been declared winners by the audience. Before we go any further, perhaps I would ask two of our expert debaters who are present here. Heather Robinson, do you want to come up first? Because you're from the UK and you stayed in the UK, we'll get your trespassers from across the Atlantic to speak later. Yeah, sure. Heather, what did you think about this debate?
Sorry, I'm just putting a clock because
At least we've had it only once in your parliament. Nowadays you debate the same motion 3 times.
With 8 meaningful votes. So I really enjoyed that debate. I've got one sort of personal bugbear that I'm going to talk about quickly. And then I think the main part of this debate for me came down to what is a problem? Because the problem got defined so many different ways throughout the debate. So I'm going to quickly look at the 3 different ways that we talked about a problem and how each of the teams responded. But before that, this debate for me needed a little bit more sense of scale, and I'm really sorry, but I'm picking on Justin because you were the last speaker and I have numbers written down that you said. So at one point Justin says, okay, if 50 smaller countries reduce their emissions, that's better than 10. Maybe, because 50 is bigger than 10. However, China is significantly bigger than the Seychelles, which makes me think that if you had 50 Seychelles-style countries who reduced their emissions, it would have no impact globally, because they're already fairly low. And I think that's something that throughout this debate is going to be helpful when you're trying to weigh up what is more important. Even if the developing world went green overnight, were carbon negative, actually, would that matter? Would China and the US still pump out more? Or actually, can the rest of the world band together and manage to save the world despite America's best attempts to burn us all? And having that clarification on either side would have been great. But the rest of it, what is a problem? I think this got talked about in 3 ways. It got talked about as something that affects countries, something that countries have created, or something that countries can solve. So firstly, the first one, something that affects countries. I think everyone agreed that everyone in the world is affected by climate change, albeit in different ways and to different extents. What I think was useful framing from the proposition team was, however, that developing countries have more problems that are affecting them every day. Part of the privilege of being in the developed world is a lot of those other problems aren't as big. I mean, I think it's untrue to say there are no problems in the developed world other than climate change, because they definitely still exist. But you can see why there's a changing of weighing up what governments have to solve straight away. And I think that was useful coming out of the proposition. But more or less everyone agreed on that. The second thing, something we have created, something that countries have created, and this was the principal debate. I think it was set up brilliantly by proposition, right? We got the historical context. I also really enjoyed the current context by the West's need for commercialization and to push consumerization as well, and to push that as an idea globally as well, which means it's still a current problem that's being created. I think that was really useful. I'll be honest, I think for a lot of it, opposition kind of chickened out of dealing with the principles. They just went, well, even if they are in principle to blame, what does that matter in the real world? Which I think was a little bit unfair, because a lot of that was quite interesting from proposition. However, we did get a little bit from the opposition, right? We get this idea of a current duty of care, that when you have a multinational company who pay a government to be present, that government is now a little bit responsible and now has some money and should put that back. One of the things that I actually thought would have been a really interesting challenge to that didn't come up was when we heard the final speaker from the proposition tell me that he was born in the 2000s, which is terrifying. That's so young. But the fact is, the way that a state was set up, as people who pay taxes, people who vote, that's not all of the children who are born post-2000, right? And I think although you brought up your age for us to empathise with you, you could have weaponised that so much more against their principal claim that you are part of a state, because children have no consent. They have no way of showing that they want to be involved with the state. So I think that would have been an excellent response. But then we got on to, and I'm just aware of the time, so I will be quick on this, something we can solve. Opposition talked about sustainable development goals, that the UN voices from developing nations are there but are consistently overlooked, that wealthier nations can avoid the worst impact, so they'll put off trying to fix things as long as possible, and that ideas of nationalism, which has had a major resurgence in the West, puts people off from getting involved in global actions. Therefore, it only relies on developing nations now. But this was against this idea that actually, can developing nations on their own do anything? It was this bit of a stalemate of who does the least amount of nothing, I think. I really enjoyed the metrics that we got from the proposition of Ben talking about how the West should just cover costs, should just pay for everything, right? This is a way they have to do very little other than just divert some money. Whether that's practical is another question, and I think it could have been hammered a little bit more by the opposition. But the final thing I want to end on this sort of stalemate of who does nothing, was a really interesting idea that we got from Shohan that I loved, right? It was the analysis of the dangers of creating legislation, assuming everyone is on equal footing, and using tech sharing rather than Ben's idea of basically technological reparations. And it created this idea of a West who creates legislation saying you have to be green now, but it's all right because we're going to do this tech sharing thing as equals. But we'll put the legislation in first, right? And then never actually get round to the tech sharing, stopping development. This was an idea that, for me personally, if it had been developed further to show how developed nations will never treat developing nations as equal partners, will always do their best to stunt them, will create barriers at every turn, instead of just being a really cool idea thrown at the end of a speech. I think that could have been debate winning. But I thought it was a fantastic debate, and all of the contributions were amazing, and all of the speakers I think could have spoken for at least 3 times as long and still been captivating. So thank you very much.
Jordan. You know, talking about democracy while Jordan is coming up, and now that we are no longer on live streaming, I felt that one of the things the proposition kept telling us was that pollution is a problem by the rich nations, for the rich nations, and of the rich nations. And the opposition reminded us, but this pollution shall not perish from the earth. Sorry to misquote a speech. And therefore is a problem of the whole earth. Sorry, Jordan.
No problem at all. So, 2 points of improvements for the team, and then my opinion on which side took the debate. The first point of improvements for the teams is to note that consistency matters. You go into a debate not as an individual speaker, but as a member of a team. And there were a number of questions in this debate where it almost seemed like speakers on the same side were giving different answers. Whether or not climate change can be solved, whether or not tech transfer is likely to take place. We almost seem to have different answers coming out of different speakers. But secondly, is a piece of advice for anyone who engages in a debate, is that most debates cannot be solved via a yes or no factual question. If the only question is, who caused climate change historically? And you can say, that was the West. That is probably not going to decide the debate. If the question is, who is more impacted by climate change? And it's the developing world, and that's a factual answer. You probably will not win the debate just with the facts alone, but with your persuasion. So what were the two questions of persuasion? Then the questions of persuasion in this debate was, are we really seeing a moral problem or a practical problem? Is the problem that's being discussed in the motion a moral one or a practical one? If it was a moral problem, well, then everyone agrees who caused climate change historically. They noted it was the West. Does this mean restorative justice? But we never really addressed the question of, is it always good to have the perpetrator of a crime be the person who fixes it? If someone stabs me, do I want him to be my surgeon? Not necessarily, especially if he might do it in a way that isn't good for me. And this is where the idea of green imperialism came in, that just because someone caused a problem doesn't mean they're the best problem to fix it. But then the whole moral question was broken up by the idea and the fact that often people do not live up to their moral obligations. Much like all of us plastic users in the room do not live up to our obligations to the poor sea turtles who we hurt. So really, what becomes important in this debate, and we don't know what solves a moral problem, and really what everyone seemed to agree on, though, was a practical question, was what best fixes climate change, seemed to be everyone's moral answer. So in the end, the debate collapses down just to the practical question of how is the problem best solved. In the debate, the teams seem to agree that the wealthy are more able to fix it. They have the money, they have the spare capacity, they have the technology to do so. It was agreed that the poorer countries are more affected. And there's almost something compelling to the idea that practically, the person who should solve a house fire is the person whose house is on fire. They're the more likely one to get involved. And also, if the practical question is who sets the best example, well, then that seems to be carbon neutral Bhutan, which would be one of the developing countries. But we have to ask ourselves, because this is a practical question, there are two worlds have been presented. One is the propositions world, where they say that the rich countries should pay for the problem to be solved, that they should share their technology and foot the bill for the developing world to solve climate change. But the problem is they're currently shirking this duty, so it's not happening right now. Donald Trump certainly isn't living up to the obligations. And secondly, we have the oppositions world, where they said the developing world should put sanctions on the richer world and cut them off until the richer world takes the correct actions. But of course, this begs the question of when is this going to happen? Why hasn't it happened already? Why hasn't the developing world already cut off the wealthier world? So we have two solutions that have been offered, neither of which is happening right now. So we have to ask ourselves, which team argued that theirs was the most likely to actually happen? And what I was most persuaded by is the opposition's idea that climate change is the most pressing problem and a more pressing problem for the developing world. So it is more likely that the developing world will act first out of necessity, will choose to sanction and cut off the wealthier world out of a necessity to act, thereby forcing the wealthier world to transfer the technology, to make the changes, and if necessary, to foot the bill for the changes the developing world makes. Therefore, because opposition seemed to have the most practical solution for me, opposition, I believe, takes this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. You know, in this country, we have parliamentary debates, which means our parliament debates. Generally, the government wins most of these debates. And then the final say on a lot of these motions, which we call laws, is decided neither by the proposition or the opposition, but by our judges in the courts. And they seem to have the last word. Keeping that tradition in debates since St. Xavier's, we ask the judges to have the last word. And I'm going to start off with Jayanta Basu. Do you want to come up and tell us a little bit about your experience? Since the judges are above the law, we cannot have a timekeeper for their talks. So they have all promised to speak less than what was the time allocated to each speaker.
Okay. On the outset, I think the result of the debate, whatever the House has decided, would have been music to somebody called Donald Trump. That wealthy nations, climate change is not a problem of wealthy nation. I think it would have been music to him. Now, when I was kind of hearing the debate, it was extremely, I think, is a wonderful debate, and wonderfully the points have been made. I was kind of transported back about a decade. It was a cool night in Copenhagen when the world first recognized the impact or the possible impact of climate change. All the big shots of global politics were there. And they debated 37 hours, which has been just broken in the recent Madrid when they debated 48 hours in addition to the scheduled hours. And in 37 hours, a whole night, the debate was in between the developed countries and the developing countries, developed and developing countries, and also the underdeveloped countries, so to say. And I was there for the whole night, and I could still, I was just reminding that when some of the developed countries grouped and said that this is an agreement, you guys take it, these are the Xerox copies, you guys take it, go back to your team, discuss for 15 minutes, signed it, and come back and submit to me. It was told by the president of that COP, that climate conference. And after 15 or half an hour, when the meeting kind of reassembled, the countries, all countries' representative came up, the final plenary was supposed to start, and everybody thought that by another half an hour, the summit would have been over. But first, the small country, Nicaragua, stood up and said to the US representative that you guys are kind of trying to give us a bribe of about $100 billion. We need that money, no doubt about that. And we are even ready to accept that bribe. But tell me, in which bank I'll be keeping that bribe, because all my country will be going underwater. And then one after another, be it Grenada, be it Barbados, be it the smaller countries, there's the dots on your map. You look at the map, you find the dots, even you won't be finding those maps. Was standing up and kind of completely dissecting the argument that the developed countries gave. I was kind of transported back to that night when I was hearing this two wonderful group of debaters. Also, I was transported back to another experience that's a last year experience. You know, the last year the COP was conducted in Katowice, the second most important city in Poland after Warsaw. And from Katowice, about a 1-hour journey, train journey, was the Ostrich and Birkenau, where one of the biggest massacres of the world has ever seen, which we call kind of the gas chamber, we all know. And when we went there and was kind of going through, and then the guide was telling us that, you know, sir, that where you are standing, within 1.5 years, 1.5 million people were kind of taken to that point, put into the gas chamber, burnt, and then they showed us the notes where the person who is in charge was saying that it is becoming too costly to kill the people, let us find out a less costly method of killing the people. And you know that you are standing there, all the ashes are kind of where we stand at the point. I thought for a second, if one global leader could kill 1.5 million people in 1.5 years, then all these global leaders across the world, they are creating another gas chamber, which we call climate emergency right now. And they are going to kill the entire world. So neither the developed nor the developing countries, I think we should say that the political leaders across the world are responsible for the climate emergency that what we are right now. So that's the feelings that immediately comes into my mind. Now, going back to the debate, 2 or 3 points I would like to make. I think the team that was kind of against the motion could have used more forcefully 2 arguments. One is about the common but differentiated responsibility. That is a kind of that is the basic of the UNFCCC argument. Because that itself says that all are responsible to combat, to counter climate change. Another is the Paris Agreement. In Paris, 200 countries, they themselves agreed that all need to contribute to counter climate change. I haven't heard a single pointer from your end talking about the Paris Agreement, which actually emphasized the point that you are all trying to emphasize. So that would have been a very good point to make. Coming to the team that spoke in favor, there's also 2 arguments you could have made. One is the Kyoto Protocol. In the Kyoto Protocol, it was clearly mentioned the Annex 1 countries, and for that matter, there's no Annex 2 countries. You mentioned Annex 2, there's nothing called Annex 2. Annex 1 countries and other countries. Annex 1 countries are historically responsible for the climate change, and you need to cut out the emission 5% or whatever. So that was another point which could have been strengthened your logic. And second is the CDM, that the mechanism where somebody sitting in New York actually could fund the emission reduction in India, in West Bengal, in Kolkata, in a village somewhere close by. So that shows the responsibility primarily with the developed countries. So these 2 arguments could have been very, very well utilized, I think, but otherwise you made very well comments. And then 2 other things I would like to mention very quickly before I round up about the content part of it, and more than that, the quality of data that you shared. Somebody actually clubbed US and China as developed countries. That's not the truth. When you are talking in terms of climate change globally, China is not part of the developed country. They are part of the G70 plus group. They are part of the emerging economies. They are part of the basic group, which has Brazil, India, China, and South Africa. So they are not the developed countries, truthfully. Second is, somebody said the temperature rise is 1.5 degrees centigrade has already happened. That's also not true. It is right now around 1%. You may say, what is the difference between 1 and 1.5? The difference is it took 100 years to reach 0.7 degree. Then you understand what the difference between 1 and 1.5. And if it happens 1.5, a major portion of the low-lying part of the world will go underwater. All of your Antarctica's major portion will melt. So that is something, and factually we need to correct ourselves. And also I find that the same data being kind of recycled, that's something of 15% and 31%. I find that same data being referred by both the group talking in favor and against as their logic. Anyway, it was a wonderful debate. I enjoyed it to the hilt. I can't comment on who has done the better because we have already marked, but it was a wonderful debate. Thank you. Thank you.
Kaushik, do you want to come up and share some of your feelings? And then Utpalda has said he will have the last word. While Dr. Kaushik Ghosh is coming up to the podium, there's a little announcement, a small housekeeping announcement, and that is that day after tomorrow, on Friday, the CDC is hosting the Calcutta Club International Debate at the Calcutta Club, the motion of which reads, in the opinion of this House, secularism is a sham. And cards for this debate are available at the desk outside for debaters who wish to come to witness this event, and you can collect it on your way out. The cards will become available as soon as this debate ends, so don't leave right now for them. They're not yet available. Kaushik.
You're serious about the time limit, right?
Very.
Right. Sat Sri Akal. Hari Om. Assalamu alaikum. You see, the debate and the observations were about the word problem. And since I'm not an authority on climate, just an orthopedic surgeon, happen to be a master of many trades, I thought the word which is interesting was climate. You know, the first settlers on the American continent killed the Red Indians, and the British came and oppressed us. So all the climate change problems of intolerance that is present all across the world and in India today, specifically in the current climate of intolerance, because of the wealthy nations. They are the people who taught us how to oppress. They are the people who taught us how to create this inequality. But that's only because I got a bit emotional, and sometimes the mind was wavering from the climate change. But having said that, I think most of these speakers out here, I would say all the speakers, actually spoke much better than if I would have spoken out here. And it was an educational thing, particularly all the data that came through. But since there was a very little humor in this entire debate, it's pretty dry. And Bhutan came up so many times. You know, when the first or the second speaker came up, I was noting on my pad out there Bhutan, because I've been to Bhutan 3 times. And this interesting story is the only country in the world which has a negative carbon footprint. And 2 reasons, one, none of which were mentioned out here. One is they do not allow deforestation. And when I asked the guide, they said even the National Geographic was not allowed to get into the forest to even take photographs of the tigers, which was supposed to be there. They had to resort to infrared cameras, and the human beings had to get out of the forest. Because not only will they not allow you to cut the trees, they think the forest is sacred, so you're not supposed to get into the forest. And the second, on a more humorous note, is the guide said, "Sir, you cannot smoke out here." Now, I happen to be a smoker. 18 hours, you haven't smoked, what do? You go to one corner, and they said, if you smoke once, the fine is 10,000 rupees. If you smoke twice, it's 20,000 rupees. Third time, you go to jail for 3 months. I said, no, I'm giving away smoking for 7 days while I'm in Bhutan. What's the secret? The secret is the current king, when he got engaged to the current queen, before he got married, the queen had only one condition. You have to quit smoking, because the king was a chain smoker. The king gave up smoking, and as a result, put an edict, nobody can smoke in the country. You see, sometimes you don't need a high economy to create climate change. Even a small little person, a woman, can cause a king to rise an edict that you cannot smoke in the country. But why did I say that? Because there were certain things which really hit a raw chord out here. Now, you know, there was this common theme which came through, as if a poor country or developing economy cannot do anything about these things the climate change controls. And it's not who's to blame. The blame game is over, because the debate is over, the opposition has won, everything is there. But it seemed that there is this common element of argument that it's only if you have industrialization that you have economic upliftment. Now, I have just met an economist out there, and I have a lot of friends in economics in JNU and Delhi School of Economics. I have read a small little book called Economics for the Jholawala by Jean Drèze. And even the books of Amartya Sen says, the moment you've destroyed agricultural economy, you've actually destroyed employment. So this argument which was propagated by both the House and the opposition slightly, that you need employment and therefore need industrialization, and that causes climate change and that causes a lot of problems, it doesn't hold water. Because it has been proved by economists all over the world that if you had those old economies, those old practices which are coming back, you would probably have more employment. The second thing that cropped up was nobody out here has actually talked about the economics of climate change in a developing economy. Now, we have talked about what is the technology that's required. the fact that a green scooty would be more expensive than a gas guzzling scooty. But what the developing economies should take into consideration, I think some of them do, but it has not been propagated by the opposition, is there is a health factor. And since I'm a doctor, there is a huge economics of what the health problems which arise because of climate change. So if you put that in the economic equation, it actually makes sense for a developing economy to invest in green technology, even if there's no sharing by the developed world to the developing world, because it makes sense in the long run that you actually save GDP, you actually save money by creating climate change, because you're actually saving on the health sector. The last thing, because we've had a long day, and I guess all of you are tired, is, you can easily blame things. I will end with a small anecdote. Bob Marley, one of my favorite musicians, had thought that evil, any kind of corruption, is a disease. Therefore, there should be an antidote. There should be a vaccine. His concept of an antidote was music. So it was this huge concert which he was organizing, and there were a lot of musicians which were coming on from all across the world, all across the United States. And just the day before, the evening before, 4 people went into his hotel room and shot him. He survived. Next day, on the stage, Bob Marley was there. The reporters asked him, the people who were the musicians out there asked him, "Why are you here?" He said, "The people who want to propagate evil do not take a day off. Why should I? Why should we take climate change for a ball game?" Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Okay, the final speaker is going to be Utpalda, who's going to share his feelings as a judge with us. Just to remind Utpalda and the other speakers who will come after him, I have been told that the students have to leave at 7:45 p.m., if I'm not wrong. Is that because Tantra opens its doors at 8? Now, it's only a joke, Shankar. Don't get so active.
Mr. Chairman, all the brilliant speakers, ladies and gentlemen, and most important, of course, I'm sorry I noticed your presence so late. My very good friend, the principal of St. Xavier's, Father Dominique Savio. At the very outset, you had said perhaps the most important thing, and which doesn't figure in the topic, that this problem is global. The impact is global. The way of handling has to be global. And this is something, I suppose, in hindsight, people who drafted the topic ought to have thought about it. But then you see, at the very outset, Mr. Chairman, you've been such a fine chairman. I'm not going to be speaking and boring the House on climate change and climate control so much, because they are super saturated with the topic. Start with you. You've been wonderful. You've been humorous. In the breaks, you've infused it with humor and your wit in your summing up. And I only wish these wonderful young speakers had taken a cue from that. Because if this debate lacks something, it lacked wit. And wit can be used with deadly effect. Let me tell you, be it at the House of Commons, be it at not so much at the House of Representatives and the Senate. You don't have too much of wit there. And unwittingly, you have wit used in our parliament, of course. But then, Mr. Chairman, many people, I'm a little old-fashioned as a debater, and I thought a debate always started by addressing the chairman first. Out here, nobody addressed even the audience, nor you. They just started the debate. But they learn. They're still very young. 2000, right? Now, I love his smile because he stole the show today in his own way. Now, I'm talking of Jordan, of course. But why am I talking about you at the very outset? Deliberately. You're such a fine chairman, and you decided, looked at the audience, and decided I attracted your attention most, so you got on me first, in the form of an analogy to emphasize on neutrality. Mr. Chairman, the All India Human Rights Council call me the legend of Bengal, although there have been countless legends of Bengal. And given the pattern of climate change, and as our good father told us at the very outset, by 2050, rest assured, Calcutta will be no more. The other thing that you said was, you said, that I was an ideal citizen. I never did. On the contrary, the nation, it was a national award. They introduced. Okay, they introduced. But they also said it was they said national award, it was a national award. So the nation said. So it is a question of the Human Rights Council and nation deciding on whether they made a mistake or whether they should rename the actual people whom you hid, put them into the kind of anonymity that nobody had any second guesses about. They all knew who you're talking about. Mr. Chairman, there have been frequent references, in fact, my preceding judges in their remarks, concluding remarks, mentioned a certain gentleman that not just the media, the whole world, finds it so difficult to define or describe. The name of the man, sans doubt, given the manner in which he's trumped during his presidency for the last 3 years, is Donald J. Trump. Now, he's escalating something, all right, or he has been part of that escalation. But talking about climate change, the manner in which he betrayed his ignorance or showed his ignorance came forth in the White House garden when he was addressing the press not too long ago. He got a bit of chill, and suddenly he looks at the entire press corps, takes his huge coat, says, "Ooh, global warming, where are you?" and winks a couple times. Now, with that kind of seriousness, if other world leaders took a lead, God help the world. Climate change is already here. The question is, when does it go? How do we and when do we handle climate control? Yesterday, ladies and gentlemen, we handled it yesterday. That is the speed we've got. Otherwise, this world will not survive. Remember Davos conference 2 years ago. President Cyril Ramaphosa of South Africa rushed out before he could attend the conference. He was talking to Richard Quest of CNN, I still remember, and he said he was catching the first flight back to Cape Town. Why? Because Cape Town had no water. Cape Town earned $5 billion in a year out of tourism, and they had no water. A person was allowed to take a shower for only 7 seconds. That is a state. In India, when you try to sink deep tube wells, there was a time when at the level of 400 feet, you could get good potable water. Today, you have to go down 100 meters in places close to Sundarbans, the mangrove forests. Because otherwise you will get only arsenic free. The National Testing Laboratory has said that. On the other hand, the water is rising. It's rising and rising. That is why Calcutta and Bombay and other cities would no longer be here, at least in India. I don't know about other places in the world which are going to be drowned for good. Then you are going to speak of these cities much in the same way as you spoke of Atlantis, as you still speak of Atlantis. Just think of the seriousness, the criticality of the whole thing. And by the way, talking of humor, I'll just end. with one thing that has nothing to do with climate control, but the situation was very, very, very critical. That was during when the Second World War had peaked. There was a lot of bombing all over the place, and in the House of Commons, you see, there was a lot of commotion in the Labour benches because of something that had come out in all the papers, that somebody had been arrested for calling the Prime Minister, who was Sir Winston Churchill, for calling the Prime Minister a fool. I mean, for a couple of hours they went on talking about that and not about what they had convened for. Well, London was being bombed. So you see, after hearing everybody, one Scottish person who was well on in years suddenly said, calling the Prime Minister a fool? For that you go behind the bars? This is disgraceful. And he looked at the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister quietly got up and said, Mr. Speaker, the man in question was not arrested because he called me, the Prime Minister, a fool, but for having divulged a national secret. Ladies and gentlemen, while leaving the podium, because everybody has to be out by 7:45, the speakers particularly, wherever they go, have a good time. Let me ask all of you to give this wonderful chairman a good hand. And let me ask you to give each and every winner, everybody who participated, 17 of them, another good hand. To each and every one of you, that has made you feel healthier. Shaking hands is good, but you did not get much hand to shake hands earlier, did you? Be that as it may, to each and every one of you, and Father Savio in particular, Mr. Chairman, the speakers, all of you, ladies and gentlemen, thank you ever so much for lending me your ears. Thank you.